The Imperium of man in the mid-32nd millennium bore little resemblance to the empire that had emerged bloodied but defiant from the Horus Heresy. 15 centuries had passed since the War Master's betrayal, and in that span of time, the wounds of that catastrophic civil war had scabbed over, leaving behind an empire that had grown complacent in its assumed invincibility. The year 544 of the 32nd millennium found humanity's galactic dominion in a state of bureaucratic ossification, its military might dispersed and diluted, its leadership more concerned with political maneuvering than the defense of mankind's borders. The High Lords of Terra, those 12 individuals who collectively governed the Imperium in the God Emperor's name, had become increasingly insular. The Senatorum Imperialis, that vast parliamentary body representing the Imperium's countless worlds, had devolved into a quagmire of factional politics and administrative theater. Debates that once concerned themselves with the strategic deployment of crusade fleets or the allocation of resources to threatened sectors now focused on matters of precedence, taxation rights, and the endless parsing of bureaucratic regulations that had accumulated like sedimentary layers over the centuries. The Lord Commander of the Imperium, the position that once held supreme military authority, had seen its power eroded by competing interests and the sheer impossibility of coordinating military action across a million worlds. The Adeptus Astartes, those transhuman warriors who had been the Emperor's finest instruments of war, existed in a state of deliberate fragmentation. The Second Founding, enacted in the aftermath of the heresy, had shattered the original legions into smaller chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each. This reformation had been deemed necessary to prevent any single commander from wielding the kind of power that had allowed Horus to drag half the Imperium into damnation. The Codex Astartes, penned by Robute Guilliman himself, had established the organizational principles that most chapters followed, but it had also ensured that the concentrated might of tens of thousands of Space Marines operating in concert would never again be brought to bear. By the time of the Great Silence, the chapters were scattered across the galaxy like seeds cast to the wind. Each maintained its own fortress monastery, its own recruiting worlds, and its own sphere of operations. The Imperial Fists, successors to Rogel Dorn's legacy, maintained their vigil from the Phalanx, that colossal star fortress that orbited Terra itself. The Ultramarines held dominion over the 500 worlds of Ultramar, that pocket empire within an empire in the eastern fringes. The Blood Angels kept watch from Baal, the Dark Angels from the Rock, the Space Wolves from Fenris. Successor chapters, born from the gene seed of the original legions, had established themselves on worlds scattered across every segmentum. The Crimson Fists held Rin's world. The Black Templars maintained no single home world, their fleets perpetually engaged in crusades across the galaxy. This dispersion meant that while the Imperium theoretically possessed thousands of Space Marines, concentrating even a fraction of that force required months of coordination and travel through the uncertain medium of the warp. The Imperial Navy had grown into a sprawling institution that bore the weight of defending shipping lanes, suppressing piracy, and maintaining the Imperium's presence across vast swathes of space. Battle fleets were assigned to specific sectors, their movements governed by ancient treaties and jurisdictional boundaries that made rapid redeployment a bureaucratic nightmare. Ship captains and admirals had grown accustomed to confronting Ork raiders, Eldar pirates, and the occasional renegade human fleet. These threats, while persistent, had become routine. The Navy had developed doctrines and tactics suited to these endemic challenges, but the institutional memory of fleet actions against a coordinated, technologically sophisticated enemy had faded. The great void battles of the Horus Heresy existed only in historical records and the training simulations that younger officers rarely took seriously. The Astra Militarum, that vast military machine comprising countless billions of soldiers drawn from every corner of the Imperium, had similarly settled into patterns of deployment suited to the galaxy's persistent but manageable threats. Regiments were raised, tithed, and dispatched to war zones where they might fight for years or decades against enemies that, while deadly, rarely threatened the fundamental stability of the Imperium. Generals and lord militants planned campaigns against Ork empires that might encompass a handful of systems, or against heretic uprisings that required the application of overwhelming force to a single world or cluster of worlds. The strategic thinking required to coordinate military operations across multiple sectors, to manage logistics chains spanning dozens of systems, and to prosecute a war against an enemy capable of striking simultaneously across a broad front had atrophied. The institutional knowledge existed in ancient texts and strategic databases, but few living commanders had ever needed to apply such principles in practice. The first indications that something had gone catastrophically wrong along the borders of Segmentum Obscurus arrived as they so often did in the Imperium, slowly, garbled, and easy to dismiss. Astropathic communications from the outer systems began to fail. This alone was unremarkable. The psychic choir that bound the Imperium together was never entirely reliable. Solar flares, warp storms, and the simple attrition of astropaths burning out their minds in service to the Imperium meant that communications blackouts were a fact of life. When worlds went silent, the assumption was that their astropaths had died and replacements had not yet arrived, or that local warp conditions had temporarily disrupted transmissions. The pattern, however, suggested something more troubling. Border worlds along the outer reaches of Segmentum Obscurus stopped reporting in a sequence that traced a rough arc across the galactic map. Garrison forces dispatched routine status updates that simply ceased. Trade vessels failed to arrive at their destinations. The trickle of tithes and taxes from these systems dried up. When questioned about these disappearances, the administratum officials responsible for those regions offered explanations rooted in the mundane chaos of imperial governance. Perhaps the local governors had proven incompetent or corrupt, leading to administrative collapse. Perhaps Ork raids had temporarily disrupted normal operations. Perhaps the Navy had requisitioned shipping for some undocumented operation. The galaxy was vast, and the Imperium's record-keeping, while exhaustive, was far from perfect. The Senatorum Imperialis, when presented with reports of these disappearances, responded with the ponderous machinery of imperial bureaucracy. Investigative committees were formed. Requests for information were dispatched to sector governors and fleet commanders. The Adeptus Arbites were tasked with determining whether criminal activity or sedition might explain the silence. These inquiries took months to organize and would take years to complete. The High Lords, occupied with their own concerns and political machinations, saw no reason to treat scattered reports of missing border worlds as a crisis requiring immediate action. The Imperium lost worlds to all manner of causes every year. They were usually reconquered or replaced in due course. The few voices that urged caution and immediate military response found themselves dismissed or ignored. Naval officers who suggested dispatching reconnaissance fleets were told that such resources could not be spared without concrete evidence of a threat. Chapter masters who offered to investigate with their forces were informed that the Adeptus Astartes should not be deployed on what was likely an administrative matter. The mechanisms of imperial governance, designed to manage an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, proved entirely inadequate for responding to a threat that moved faster than the bureaucracy could process information. The technological capabilities of the Imperium's military forces had likewise stagnated. The Mechanicus, that priesthood of Mars which maintained and manufactured the Imperium's war machines, had long since abandoned innovation in favor of preservation. Standard template construct patterns from the dark age of technology were treated as holy relics, to be replicated exactly rather than improved upon. The weapons, vehicles, and ships that the Imperial military deployed in the 32nd millennium were fundamentally identical to those used during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Bolters, Las weapons, and plasma guns, Leman Rust tanks and Chimera transports, cruisers and battleships whose designs had remained unchanged for millennia. This technological conservatism meant that the Imperium possessed no significant advantages over the weapons systems it had fielded 15 centuries earlier, and in many cases, the quality of manufacture had declined as knowledge was lost and replaced with rote repetition of sacred production rituals. The complacency extended beyond mere military preparedness into the very psychology of the Imperium's leadership and warrior classes. The Horus Heresy had been a trauma so profound that it had reshaped the entire structure of imperial governance and military organization, but 1,500 years of relative stability had dulled the edge of that memory. The younger generations of officers, administrators, and even space marines knew the heresy only as history, as something that had happened to their ancestors. The threats they faced in their own lifetimes seemed manageable by comparison. Orks could be defeated through attrition and superior coordination. Eldar raids could be endured and avenged. Chaos cults could be rooted out by the Inquisition and the Arbites. The notion that the Imperium might face an existential threat, something that could genuinely imperil humanity's dominion over the galaxy, had become almost unthinkable. The first concrete evidence that the Imperium faced something unprecedented arrived not through the usual channels of astropathic communication or Navy reconnaissance, but through the shattered remnants of a Crusade fleet that had been dispatched to investigate the silence in Segmentum Obscurus. The vessels that limped back into Imperial space bore the scars of weapons that should not have existed in the arsenal of any greenskin force. Hull breaches showed the telltale signs of gravitational shearing, as if the very fabric of space had been twisted and torn. Entire sections of warships had been crushed inward or pulled apart, the metal folded and compressed in ways that conventional weapons could not achieve. The survivors, those crew members who had not been killed in the initial engagement or driven mad by what they had witnessed, brought reports that the Administratum and the High Lords initially dismissed as the ravings of traumatized minds. The Orks, they claimed, had returned with technology that rivaled or exceeded the Imperium's own. Vast planetoid-sized constructs had emerged from the outer darkness, mobile fortresses that dwarfed even the largest Imperial battleships. These attack moons, as they would come to be designated, possessed weapons capable of tearing apart cruisers with invisible forces that bypassed void shields and armor plating entirely. The greenskins had deployed teleportation technology with a precision and reliability that the Mechanicus had never achieved outside of the most sacred and ancient Terminator armor systems. Void shields of unprecedented strength had shrugged off lance batteries and torpedo barrages that should have crippled any Ork vessel. Most disturbing of all were the reports of the Orks themselves, descriptions of warlords that stood as tall as dreadnoughts, whose mere presence seemed to radiate a psychic pressure that affected even those without psyker abilities. The Inquisition, always more willing to credit reports of the unusual and the dangerous, began its own investigation. Inquisitors with experience in dealing with Xeno's threats pulled together fragments of information from across the affected regions. Intercepted Ork communications, analyzed by those rare individuals who understood the greenskin language, revealed references to beings called the Beasts, spoken of with a reverence that Orks typically reserved only for their greatest warlords. The psychic choir of astropaths stationed near the affected regions reported disturbances in the warp, presences that burned with the characteristic brutal simplicity of Ork psychic emanations, but magnified to a degree that suggested something far beyond the normal scale of Wa energy. When the first confirmed sightings of these prime Orks reached Terra, the descriptions strained credulity. The creatures stood approximately 10 meters tall, their physiology representing an extreme expression of the Ork species' already formidable physical characteristics. Unlike the typical warboss, whose size resulted from decades or centuries of accumulated victories, and the psychosomatic growth that accompanied rising status in greenskin society, these prime Orks appeared to have achieved their massive stature through some other mechanism. Their musculature was dense and corded, their skin a deep green that was almost black in certain light. They wore armor that combined the characteristic crude aesthetics of Ork manufacture with a level of sophistication in its construction that suggested actual engineering principles rather than the usual greenskin approach of bolting metal plates together until something worked. The intelligence these creatures displayed proved even more disturbing than their physical presence. Orks were known for their cunning in matters of warfare, but that cunning typically expressed itself in tactics suited to their nature, overwhelming assaults, the exploitation of numerical superiority, and an instinctive understanding of how to apply violence most effectively. The beasts demonstrated strategic thinking that operated on a completely different level. They coordinated operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. They established supply lines and logistics networks that kept their forces equipped and reinforced. They deployed feints and diversionary attacks to draw Imperial forces out of position before striking at undefended targets. They adapted their tactics in response to Imperial countermeasures with a speed that suggested genuine analytical capability rather than simple trial and error. Reports from the few Imperial commanders who survived encounters with forces directly led by the beasts described a level of battlefield coordination that defied everything the Imperium understood about Ork psychology. Greenskin forces typically fought with enthusiasm that bordered on suicidal, each mob of boys eager to get stuck in without much regard for overall strategy. Under the direction of the beasts, Ork armies maneuvered with purpose and discipline. They established firing positions and held them. They conducted organized withdrawals when situations turned against them, preserving their forces for future engagements rather than fighting to the last Ork. They employed combined arms tactics, coordinating the actions of infantry, armor, and aircraft in ways that maximized their effectiveness. Most troubling of all, they learned from their defeats, analyzing Imperial tactics and developing countermeasures that they deployed in subsequent battles. The psychic presence of the beasts manifested in ways that affected the entire Ork species across vast regions of space. The Wa energy that all Orks generated through their collective psychic field intensified in systems where the beasts operated. Ork technology functioned more reliably, their ramshackle vehicles and weapons performing with an efficiency that approached or exceeded their theoretical capabilities. Greenskin forces fought with a unity of purpose that transcended the usual factional infighting and competition for dominance. Smaller warbosses and their warbands, who would typically spend as much time fighting each other as fighting the Imperium, coordinated their actions as if following some unspoken directive. The beasts appeared to exert a gravitational pull on Ork society itself, drawing disparate elements together into a unified war machine. The scale of the Greenskin Empire that had emerged in the outer reaches of Segmentum Obscurus became apparent only gradually, as Imperial reconnaissance forces penetrated deeper into the affected regions and survived long enough to report back. Dozens of star systems had fallen under Ork control, their human populations either exterminated or enslaved to work in the massive industrial complexes the Greenskins had established. Forge worlds of a sort had been constructed, though they bore little resemblance to the ordered manufactories of the Mechanicus. These facilities produced weapons, vehicles, and ships in quantities that suggested the Orks had access to resources on a scale normally associated with major Imperial sectors. The infrastructure required to support such production capacity indicated planning and organization that should have been impossible for a species whose civilization typically collapsed into internecine warfare whenever it lacked external enemies to fight. The attack moons themselves represented the pinnacle of this resurgent Ork technological capability. Each one was a planetoid that had been hollowed out and converted into a mobile fortress, its surface bristling with weapon emplacements and shielded by void shields of such power that they could withstand sustained bombardment from entire Imperial battle fleets. The propulsion systems that moved these celestial bodies through space operated on principles that the Mechanicus could not immediately identify, generating thrust without the massive plasma drives that would have been required to move such mass using conventional technology. The gravitational weapons mounted on these attack moons manipulated space-time itself, creating tidal forces that could tear apart ships or even damage planetary bodies. Imperial vessels caught in the effective range of these weapons experienced catastrophic structural failure, as different sections of their hulls were subjected to gravitational stresses pulling in different directions. The technological sophistication extended beyond the attack moons to the broader Ork war machine. Teleportation technology, which the Imperium employed sparingly due to its complexity and the risk of catastrophic failure, appeared throughout the Greenskin forces. Ork boarding parties materialized directly inside Imperial vessels, bypassing void shields and armor entirely. Ground forces teleported into Imperial defensive positions, appearing behind fortifications that should have been impregnable. The accuracy and reliability of these teleportation systems exceeded what the Mechanicus achieved with their own devices, a fact that caused considerable consternation among the tech priests who analyzed captured Ork equipment. The void shields protecting Ork vessels and installations demonstrated similar advances. Standard Imperial doctrine for engaging Ork ships involved overwhelming their typically weak shields with concentrated fire, then exploiting the resulting vulnerability to inflict critical damage. The shields employed by the forces of the beasts proved far more resilient, absorbing punishment that would have collapsed conventional defensive fields. Multiple Imperial battle groups reported expending their entire ammunition reserves against Ork vessels without achieving kills, the enemy's shields flickering, but holding under bombardment that should have reduced the ships to debris. The energy requirements for maintaining such powerful shields suggested power generation capabilities that matched or exceeded Imperial standards, another impossibility that forced a fundamental reassessment of Ork technological potential. Weapon systems deployed by the greenskin forces showed similar sophistication. While Ork armies still employed the characteristic shutas, choppas, and ramshackle vehicles that had always defined their military aesthetic, these weapons functioned with a reliability and effectiveness that suggested actual engineering rather than the psychic field effect that typically made Ork technology work despite its apparent impossibility. Captured weapons examined by the Mechanicus revealed construction techniques and materials science that indicated genuine understanding of the principles involved. The Orks were not simply building weapons that worked because they believed they should work. They were building weapons that functioned according to actual physical laws, weapons that would have worked even without the psychic field that suffused greenskin technology. The implications of this technological renaissance troubled those Imperial analysts who understood Ork history beyond the simplified accounts taught to most military officers. The greenskins were not simply a primitive species that happened to be good at fighting. They were the degenerate descendants of the Krork, warrior constructs created by the Old Ones during the war in Heaven millions of years ago. Those ancient Krork had possessed technology that rivaled or exceeded anything the Eldar or the Necrons deployed, weapons and devices that had been necessary to fight the Khatan and their servants. Over the millennia since the war in Heaven, the Ork species had degenerated, their technology becoming cruder and their society devolving into the endless cycle of violence and tribal warfare that characterized them in the current era. The appearance of the beasts and the technological sophistication of their forces suggested a reversion toward that ancient baseline, a return to capabilities that the Orks' ancestors had possessed, but which had been lost over countless generations. The number of these prime Orks remained unclear in the early stages of the conflict. Initial reports suggested a single supreme warlord, a beast around which the entire Greenskin Empire had coalesced. As Imperial forces engaged the enemy across a broader front, however, evidence accumulated that pointed toward multiple beings of this magnitude. Intercepted communications referenced different beasts operating in different regions. Psychic reconnaissance detected multiple sources of the overwhelming Wa energy that characterized these creatures. By the time the Imperium fully grasped the scope of the threat, analysts had identified at least 6 distinct prime Orks, each apparently commanding their own forces while somehow maintaining coordination with the others. Whether these beasts represented a council of equals or operated under some hierarchy remained unclear, but their ability to function as a unified command structure, rather than descending into the typical Ork pattern of fighting each other for dominance, suggested either unprecedented discipline or some form of psychic coordination that transcended normal greenskin behavior. The unified nature of the Greenskin Empire under the beasts represented perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire threat. Ork Wars typically followed a predictable pattern. A warboss would rise to dominance through violence, gathering followers and momentum until the resulting horde crashed against Imperial defenses. These Wars burned hot and fast, achieving spectacular initial successes before eventually collapsing due to infighting, overextension, or the death of the warboss holding the entire structure together. The Empire of the Beasts showed no signs of following this pattern. It expanded methodically, consolidating control over conquered territories rather than simply looting them and moving on. It maintained supply lines and logistics networks that kept forces in the field indefinitely. It demonstrated strategic patience, building strength and infrastructure rather than immediately throwing every available orc at the nearest enemy. This represented a fundamental departure from orc behavior, a transformation that suggested the Imperium faced not simply an unusually large Wa, but something closer to a genuine rival civilization. The Forge World Artamantua had stood as a monument to the Mechanicus' industrial might for over 4,000 years. Located in the Segmentum Obscurus, it occupied a system rich in mineral resources that had been exploited since the early days of the Great Crusade. The world itself had been transformed over millennia into a planet-spanning factory complex, its original surface buried beneath kilometers of manufactories, refineries, and processing facilities. Hundreds of billions of servitors and tech priests labored in its depths, producing everything from basic ammunition and spare parts to sophisticated weapon systems and void ship components. The Forge World's output supplied Imperial forces across a dozen nearby sectors, its production capacity making it a linchpin in the Segmentum's military infrastructure. The defenses of Artamantua reflected its strategic importance. Orbital weapons platforms ringed the planet in multiple layers, their lance batteries and macro cannons capable of reducing approaching fleets to scrap before they could achieve firing positions. The world's surface bristled with anti-aircraft emplacements and void shield generators that created overlapping defensive fields strong enough to withstand sustained orbital bombardment. The Skitarii legions stationed on Artamantua numbered in the hundreds of millions, augmented warriors equipped with the finest weapons the Mechanicus could produce and organized into cohorts that trained constantly in defensive operations. Titan legions walked the surface, their god machines maintained in a state of perpetual readiness. The Forge World possessed its own naval assets, a fleet of cruisers and escorts that patrolled the system and provided additional firepower to supplement the fixed defenses. The Mechanicus leadership on Artamantua had received the same fragmentary reports as the rest of the Imperium regarding the silence spreading across the outer systems. The Fabricator General who governed the Forge World, a tech priest who had overseen its operations for 3 centuries, had responded by increasing defensive readiness and accelerating production schedules. Additional Skitarii cohorts were activated from reserve status. The Titan legions conducted more frequent patrol patterns. The orbital defense grid underwent maintenance cycles to ensure all systems functioned at peak efficiency. These preparations, while prudent, were based on the assumption that any threat would follow the established patterns of orc aggression, a disorganized horde that could be defeated through superior firepower and coordination. The attack moon that translated into the Artamantua system arrived without warning. One moment, the system's outer reaches were empty except for the usual patrol vessels and monitoring stations. The next, a planetoid the size of a small moon materialized from the warp, its surface covered in the crude glyphs and totemic imagery characteristic of orc construction, but on a scale that defied comprehension. The monitoring stations that detected the arrival had mere seconds to transmit warnings before gravitational distortions emanating from the attack moon tore them apart, the sensor arrays and their crews crushed into compressed fragments of metal and flesh. The Mechanicus fleet moved to intercept, a force of 3 cruisers and 8 escorts that represented a significant naval presence by the standards of most Forge World defense forces. The engagement that followed lasted less than an hour. The Orc vessel's void shields absorbed the initial bombardment from the Imperial ships without visible effect, the energy from lance strikes and torpedo impacts dissipating across defensive fields that shouldn't have been possible for greenskin technology. When the attack moon returned fire, its weapons demonstrated capabilities that the Mechanicus had no frame of reference for understanding. Gravitational beams reached out across the void, invisible forces that grabbed Imperial vessels and crushed them like a human hand crumpling parchment. The lead cruiser, a vessel that had served for over 2,000 years, folded in on itself as different sections of its hull were subjected to gravitational stresses, pulling in opposite directions. The ship's plasma reactor breached, and the resulting explosion consumed two of the escorts that had been moving in formation alongside it. The remaining Imperial vessels attempted to withdraw, their captains recognizing that they faced something their weapons could not harm. Teleportation signatures bloomed across their sensor arrays as Ork boarding parties materialized directly inside their ships, bypassing void shields and hull armor entirely. The greenskins that appeared in the corridors and chambers of the Imperial vessels stood taller and broader than typical Orks, their armor more sophisticated, and their weapons firing with a precision that suggested actual training, rather than the usual Ork approach of pointing in the general direction of the enemy and pulling the trigger. The ship crews, despite fighting with the desperate ferocity of those who knew no help would arrive, were overwhelmed within minutes. The last transmissions from the dying vessels described Orks moving with coordinated precision, clearing sections of the ships with a methodical efficiency that seemed impossible for a species known for its chaotic approach to warfare. The destruction of the defense fleet left Artamantua's orbital defenses as the only barrier between the attack moon and the Forge world itself. The weapons platforms opened fire as soon as the Ork vessel entered their effective range, thousands of lance batteries and macro cannons unleashing a barrage that would have crippled a conventional fleet. The attack moon's shields held, the defensive fields flickering, but never collapsing even under sustained fire from emplacements that had been designed to destroy battleships. The Ork vessel advanced through the defensive perimeter, its own weapons systematically eliminating the platforms one by one. Gravitational beams tore stations apart, the metal structures crumpling or being pulled apart depending on how the forces were applied. Secondary weapons, massive projectile cannons that fired shells the size of HAB blocks, smashed through void shields and punched through armor plating with kinetic energy that suggested propulsion systems far more efficient than anything the Imperium employed. The Fabricator General, monitoring the battle from deep within Artamantua's most heavily fortified command bunker, made the decision to request immediate assistance from any Imperial forces within range. Astropathic messages screamed out across the warp, desperate pleas for aid that painted a picture of a Forge world under assault by an enemy that possessed capabilities no Ork force should have had. The messages reached Imperial installations across multiple sectors, their urgency clear even through the distortion and degradation that affected all psychic communication. Naval battle groups began plotting courses toward Artamantua. Space Marine chapters within range of the distress calls prepared strike forces for immediate deployment. The response, however, would take time, and time was something the Forge world did not have. The attack moon achieved orbital position above Artamantua's primary manufacturing centers and began its assault on the surface. The Forge world's void shields, powerful enough to withstand conventional orbital bombardment indefinitely, proved inadequate against the gravitational weapons the Orks deployed. The shields distorted and collapsed under stresses they had not been designed to resist, the generator complexes overloading and exploding as they attempted to maintain defensive fields against forces that bypassed conventional energy absorption mechanisms. With the shields down, the attack moon deployed its ground forces through a combination of drop pods and teleportation, hundreds of thousands of Orks materializing directly on the surface or crashing down in crude but effective landing craft. The Skitarii legions met the Ork assault with disciplined fire and coordinated defensive positions, their augmented bodies and sophisticated weapon systems giving them significant advantages in the initial engagements. Rad carbines and arc rifles cut down greenskins by the hundreds, the Skitarii's targeting systems ensuring that nearly every shot found its mark. Battle servitors, massive cybernetic constructs mounting heavy weapons, provided supporting fire that could shred entire mobs of Orks. The defenses held for the first hours of the assault, the Mechanicus forces inflicting casualties that would have broken a conventional Ork attack through sheer attrition. The Orks, however, kept coming in numbers that suggested the attack moon carried a population measured in the millions rather than the thousands. More significantly, they adapted their tactics in response to the Skitarii' defensive strategies with a speed that shocked the Mechanicus commanders. Ork forces that encountered concentrated fire from fixed positions withdrew and maneuvered to attack from different angles rather than simply charging headlong into the guns. Greenskin armor, crude-looking vehicles covered in spikes and painted in garish colors, provided mobile fire support that suppressed Skitarii positions while infantry advanced under cover. The Orks employed actual combined arms tactics, coordinating the actions of different unit types in ways that maximized their effectiveness and minimized their exposure to the defenders' weapons. The Titan legions deployed to stem the green tide god machines that had walked Artamantua's surface for millennia, striding into battle against an enemy that should have broken and fled before their might. The warlord Titans, towering war machines mounting weapons capable of leveling city blocks with single shots, inflicted horrific casualties on the Ork forces. Their void shields turned aside the crude projectiles and energy weapons that the greenskins fired at them, and their own weapons carved swathes of destruction through the enemy ranks. For a brief period, it seemed that the Titans might turn the tide, their presence rallying the Skitarii and forcing the Orks onto the defensive. The Ork response demonstrated the true scale of the threat Artamantua faced. Gargant's massive Ork war machines that matched the Titans in size and exceeded them in crude firepower, teleported directly onto the battlefield. These constructs, covered in armor plating and bristling with weapons, engaged the Imperial god machines in combat that shook the ground for kilometers around. More troubling were the specialized Ork units that appeared to have been designed specifically for Titan killing operations. Massive mobs of greenskins wielding power claws and melta weapons swarmed individual Titans, climbing the god machines and tearing into their armor with tools that could rip through plasteel and ceramite. Ork aircraft, ramshackle-looking but disturbingly effective, dropped specialized munitions that overloaded void shields or jammed targeting systems. The Titan legions fought with the desperation of warriors who understood that their fall would doom the Forge world. Princeps, who had piloted their machines for centuries, pushed their god machines to the limits of their operational parameters, accepting damage and strain that would require months of repair work in exchange for killing more of the enemy. The machine spirits of the Titans, those artificial intelligences that bonded with their crews, screamed in rage and pain as Ork weapons found vulnerable points and inflicted critical damage. One by one, the god machines fell. Some were swarmed and torn apart by mobs of Orks that climbed their legs and torsos, cutting through armor and vital systems until the Titans collapsed. Others were destroyed in single catastrophic moments when Gargant weapons found their plasma reactors or ammunition stores. The last warlord Titan on Artamantua died when gravitational beams from the attack moon itself focused on its position. The god machine crushed flat as if stepped on by some invisible giant. The relief forces that the Imperium had dispatched began arriving in the Artamantua system during the final days of the Forge world's resistance. The Fists Exemplar, a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, translated from the warp at the system's edge with a strike force of 3 companies. Additional elements from other Imperial Fists successors arrived in a staggered sequence over the following hours, their ships emerging from the warp at different points as the vagaries of warp travel prevented coordinated arrival. The Space Marines, among the Imperium's finest warriors, and equipped with weapons and armor that made them the equal of dozens of normal soldiers, represented a force that should have been capable of turning the tide of any conventional ground engagement. The tactical situation they found left no room for conventional deployment. The attack moon still held orbital position above Artamantua, its weapons and remaining Ork forces ensuring that any attempt to land on the surface would result in the Space Marines being destroyed before they could make planetfall. The Forge world's surface had been transformed into a hellscape of burning manufactories and desperate last stands, the remaining Mechanicus forces reduced to isolated pockets, fighting delaying actions against an enemy that had already achieved strategic victory. The The Space Marine commanders, assessing the situation with the cold tactical analysis that their training demanded, recognized that they had arrived too late to save the Forge world, but might still accomplish something if they acted with precision and speed. The Fist's Exemplar launched a desperate assault on the attack moon itself, their strike cruisers closing to boarding range while their escorts provided covering fire. Thunderhawks and boarding torpedoes carried Space Marines directly into the Ork fortress, the Astartes warriors cutting their way through the crude corridors and chambers in an attempt to reach critical systems or command centers. The fighting inside the attack moon demonstrated the full horror of what the Imperium now faced. The Orks defending the interior fought with a discipline and coordination that seemed impossible, establishing kill zones and falling back in good order when positions became untenable. The greenskins were larger and tougher than the typical Orks the Space Marines had fought in countless previous engagements, their weapons inflicting casualties even on warriors in power armor. The Space Marines penetrated deep into the attack moon's interior, their advance measured in meters paid for, with the lives of battle brothers who had served the Imperium for decades or centuries. They discovered manufacturing facilities that produced weapons and ammunition on a scale that rivaled Imperial production capacity, vast chambers where Ork mechboys supervised the construction of vehicles and war machines, using techniques that combined crude aesthetics with disturbingly sophisticated engineering. They encountered command centers where Ork warlords directed operations with the aid of actual tactical displays and communication systems, rather than simply bellowing orders at their subordinates. Most disturbing of all were the chambers that appeared to serve some biological or reproductive function, vast spaces filled with fungal growth and spore pods that suggested the attack moon could sustain and replace its Ork population indefinitely. The assault ultimately failed when Ork reinforcements, teleporting directly into the corridors behind the Space Marine advance, cut off their line of retreat. The Astartes warriors found themselves trapped deep inside the attack moon, fighting in all directions against an enemy that kept coming in endless waves. The commanders of the relief force, monitoring the situation from their ships, made the agonizing decision to order a withdrawal before the entire strike force was lost. The Space Marines still inside the attack moon, when the order came through, fought to the last bolt shell and the last swing of their chainswords, selling their lives to buy time for their brothers to escape. The Vox transmissions from Artamantua's final hours spread across nearby sectors with a speed that suggested someone, whether Imperial authorities or the Orks themselves, wanted the Imperium to know what had happened. The recordings captured the desperation of defenders who understood they were doomed, but fought on anyway, their last acts defiant gestures against an enemy that had already won. Tech priests recited the litany of the Omnissiah, even as Ork weapons tore through their augmented bodies. Skitarii cohorts maintained formation and fire discipline until the last warrior fell. The Fabricator General's final transmission, sent from deep within the command bunker as Ork forces breached the final defensive layers, consisted of a simple statement of fact delivered in the emotionless cant of the Mechanicus. The Forge world had fallen, its production capacity lost to the Imperium, its defenders dead or soon to be. The news from Artamantua reached the Imperial Fist's chapter on Terra within hours of the Forge world's fall, the astropathic transmissions burning through the warp with an urgency that left several of the receiving psychers catatonic or dead. Chapter Master Odinathus, who had led the Sons of Rogel Dorn for nearly 3 centuries, convened his command council aboard the Phalanx immediately upon receiving confirmation of what had occurred. The massive Star Fortress, which had served as the mobile headquarters of the Imperial Fists since the days of the Great Crusade, hung in high orbit above Terra, its weapons and sensors maintaining eternal vigilance over humanity's throne world. The chapter master's decision came swiftly and without debate among his captains. The Imperial Fists would deploy in full chapter strength to confront this threat that had destroyed a Forge world and mauled successor chapters that had attempted to intervene. The mobilization of an entire Space Marine chapter represented an undertaking of significant complexity, even for a force as disciplined and organized as the Imperial Fists. Nearly 1,000 battle brothers prepared for immediate deployment, checking their weapons and armor, conducting final maintenance rituals on their wargear, and making whatever spiritual preparations their individual beliefs demanded. The chapter's fleet elements, cruisers and strike cruisers that had carried the Imperial fists across the galaxy for millennia, underwent final system checks and took on supplies for extended operations. The tech marines who maintained the chapter's vehicles and equipment worked in shifts around the clock to ensure that every tank, every dreadnought, and every piece of support equipment functioned at peak efficiency. The apothecarian prepared additional gene seed storage and medical facilities, anticipating casualties even as they hoped their preparations would prove unnecessary. Odenathus himself was a warrior who embodied the stoic determination that had characterized the Imperial fists since their founding. He had fought Orks before, had led campaigns against greenskin empires that threatened Imperial worlds, and understood the Xenos species better than most commanders outside the Death Watch. The reports from Artamantua troubled him precisely because they described Ork capabilities and behaviors that contradicted everything his centuries of experience had taught him. Orks did not build attack moons. Orks did not employ gravitational weapons. Orks did not coordinate multi-system campaigns with strategic patience. Yet the evidence was undeniable, confirmed by multiple sources, and corroborated by the testimony of survivors whose credibility could not be questioned. The Imperium faced something new, or perhaps something very old that had returned, and the Imperial fists would meet this threat as they had met every challenge since Rogel Dorn had first led them into battle during the Unification Wars. The Chapter Master's strategic assessment identified the Ork force's apparent center of operations based on the pattern of attacks and the trajectory of their expansion into Imperial space. Intelligence gathered from Navy reconnaissance and inquisitorial sources pointed toward a cluster of systems in Segmentum Obscurus that had gone silent in the early stages of the Greenskin offensive. Odenathus selected the Artamantua system itself as the Imperial Fist's target, reasoning that the Orks would have established significant infrastructure there after conquering the Forge world. The destruction of that infrastructure and the elimination of whatever Ork leadership had overseen the attack would serve as both a strategic blow and a demonstration that the Imperium's Space Marines remained the superior warriors regardless of what technological advantages the Greenskins had somehow acquired. The Imperial Fist's fleet translated into the Artamantua system 3 weeks after the Forge world's fall, emerging from the warp at a distance that allowed them to assess the tactical situation before committing to engagement. What they found exceeded even the worst predictions of the Chapter Master's intelligence officers. The system contained not one but multiple attack moons, the massive Ork constructs positioned throughout the inner system in a deployment pattern that suggested actual strategic thinking rather than random placement. The Forge world itself had been transformed in the short time since its conquest, its surface now covered in additional Ork construction that had been built atop the ruins of the Mechanicus facilities. Greenskin vessels, ranging from crude frigates to battleship-sized constructs, patrolled the system in numbers that suggested a substantial fleet presence. The orbital space around Artamantua was thick with debris from the earlier battle, the shattered remains of Imperial vessels and defense platforms forming a cloud of wreckage that would make navigation hazardous. The Ork response to the Imperial Fist's arrival demonstrated the same coordination and tactical awareness that had characterized their earlier operations. Rather than immediately rushing to engage the Space Marine fleet in a disorganized brawl, the Greenskin vessels maneuvered into formations that provided mutual support and covered approaches to the attack moons. The Ork commanders, whoever or whatever they were, had apparently anticipated that Imperial forces would return and had prepared positions accordingly. This defensive posture, so contrary to typical Ork behavior, forced Odenathus to revise his tactical approach even as his fleet advanced deeper into the system. The Battle of Artamantua began when the Imperial Fist's fleet engaged the outer screen of Ork vessels, the Space Marine cruisers opening fire at maximum range with lance batteries and torpedo spreads. The initial exchanges revealed immediately that the Orks had learned from their earlier encounters with Imperial forces. their void shields, while still somewhat erratic in the characteristic greenskin manner, proved far more resilient than standard Ork defensive fields. Their weapons, a mix of conventional projectile cannons and the gravitational beam systems that had proven so devastating at the Forge World's fall, demonstrated effective range and accuracy that forced the Imperial Fist's captains to maneuver more cautiously than they had anticipated. The Space Marine vessels, crewed by chapter serfs who had trained for decades in void warfare and commanded by officers who understood ship-to-ship combat as thoroughly as ground operations, pressed their attack with the methodical precision that characterized all Imperial Fist's operations. The fighting in the void lasted for hours, the two fleets exchanging fire as they maneuvered for advantage in the three-dimensional battle space. The Imperial Fists achieved several kills in the opening stages, their superior gunnery and coordinated fire bringing down Ork vessels that were isolated or caught out of position. The greenskins, however, demonstrated a willingness to accept losses in exchange for drawing the Space Marine fleet deeper into the system and closer to the attack moons. When the Imperial Fist's cruisers reached what the Ork commanders had apparently designated as their kill zone, the attack moons opened fire with their primary weapons. The gravitational beams that lanced out from the massive Ork constructs caught two Imperial Fist's cruisers in their invisible grip, the vessel's void shields offering no protection against weapons that manipulated space-time itself rather than projecting energy or matter. The ships crumpled, their hulls folding inward as gravitational stresses tore through their structure. One vessel's plasma reactor detonated when the containment fields failed under the impossible forces being applied to them, the explosion consuming the ship and damaging two nearby escorts. The other cruiser simply collapsed into a compressed sphere of metal and flesh, its crew dead before they could even understand what was happening to their vessel. The loss of two cruisers in as many minutes forced Odenathus to order a tactical withdrawal, his fleet pulling back beyond the effective range of the attack moon's primary weapons, while his officers reassessed their approach. The chapter master made the decision that would ultimately doom his chapter based on the tactical realities he faced. The Imperial Fists could not defeat the Ork fleet and the attack moons through conventional void warfare, not without sustaining casualties that would cripple their ground combat capability. However, Space Marines excelled at boarding actions and close-quarters combat, environments where their superior training, equipment, and transhuman physiology gave them overwhelming advantages. Odenathus ordered his fleet to close with the nearest attack moon, his cruisers and escorts providing covering fire, while Thunderhawks and boarding torpedoes launched toward the Ork construct. The Imperial Fists would take the battle to the enemy directly, would board the attack moon and destroy it from within, and would demonstrate that no Ork fortification could stand against the sons of Rogel Dorn. The assault force consisted of over 800 Space Marines, nearly the entire chapter's combat strength committed to a single operation. They struck the attack moon at multiple points simultaneously, boarding torpedoes punching through the crude exterior armor, while Thunderhawks deposited assault squads at what appeared to be access points and weapon emplacements. The Imperial Fists cut their way inside, their bolters and chainswords making short work of the initial Ork defenders they encountered. The interior of the attack moon was a nightmare of crude construction and Orkish architecture, corridors that seemed to follow no logical pattern and chambers whose purposes were not immediately apparent. The Space Marines advanced in squad strength units, maintaining Vox contact and coordinating their movements as they pushed deeper into the massive construct. The Ork resistance intensified as the Imperial Fists penetrated further from their entry points. The greenskins defending the attack moon's interior were larger and better equipped than the typical Ork boys the Space Marines had fought in previous campaigns. They wore armor that combined plates of crude metal with more sophisticated components that might have been looted from Imperial sources or might have been Ork-manufactured equivalents. Their weapons fired with an accuracy that suggested actual training or at least some form of targeting assistance. They fought from prepared positions, establishing kill zones and fields of fire that maximized their defensive advantages. Most troubling was their discipline. the way they fell back in good order when positions became untenable, and the way they coordinated their actions across multiple squads without apparent communication. Captain Slaughter, who commanded the Imperial Fist's 3rd Company, led his warriors through a section of the attack moon that appeared to house some form of command and control facilities. His company encountered Ork warlords that stood nearly as tall as space marines, their massive frames encased in armor that turned aside bolter rounds, and whose power claws could tear through ceramite plate. The fighting devolved into brutal close combat, chainswords screaming against Ork choppas, and power fists smashing through greenskin armor. Slaughter himself killed 3 of the massive Orks, his master crafted power sword opening them from shoulder to hip, but his company paid for every meter of advance with the lives of battle brothers who had served the chapter for decades. The trap closed when Ork reinforcements began teleporting directly into the corridors behind the Imperial Fist's advance. The greenskins appeared in massive numbers, fresh warriors materializing in positions that cut off the Space Marines' lines of retreat and divided their forces into isolated pockets. The teleportation technology that the Orks employed functioned with a precision that should have been impossible, depositing entire mobs of boys exactly where they needed to be to achieve maximum tactical effect. The Imperial Fists found themselves fighting in all directions simultaneously, their ammunition reserves depleting as they struggled to maintain cohesion against an enemy that seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of reinforcements. Chapter Master Odinathus recognized the disaster unfolding around him when Vox contact with multiple companies began cutting out, the last transmissions describing being overrun by Ork numbers that defied counting. He ordered a general withdrawal, commanded all Imperial Fist's forces to fight their way back to their entry points and evacuate the attack moon. The order came too late for most of the chapter. The Orks had positioned their forces to prevent exactly such a withdrawal, and the Space Marines who attempted to retreat found their paths blocked by greenskin mobs that had been waiting for precisely this moment. Squad after squad reported being surrounded, their final transmissions consisting of bolt pistol fire and the sound of chainswords cutting through Ork flesh before the Vox went silent. Odinathus himself died leading a desperate charge to break through an Ork position that blocked the route to the nearest extraction point. The chapter master, wielding the relic blade that had been carried by Imperial Fist's commanders since the Great Crusade, cut down dozens of Orks before a power claw the size of a man's torso caught him across the chest. His armor, which had turned aside countless blows over 3 centuries of warfare, cracked under the impact. The chapter master's last words, transmitted across the Vox network to whatever Imperial Fists remained alive to hear them, were a simple statement that the Sons of Dorn died standing, and that the chapter's honor remained intact even in defeat. Captain Slaughter survived through a combination of tactical skill, desperate courage, and sheer chance. His company had been fighting near one of the Imperial Fist's original entry points when the withdrawal order came through, and they still maintained a tenuous connection to that breach in the attack moon's hull. Slaughter led the survivors of his company in a fighting retreat, his warriors maintaining fire discipline even as Orks pressed them from multiple directions. They reached the breach to find their Thunderhawk still waiting, its pilot having remained at station, despite the obvious danger in the hope that Space Marines would return. Fewer than 30 Imperial Fists made it aboard the gunship, the last survivors of a chapter that had numbered nearly 1,000 warriors hours earlier. The Thunderhawk's escape from the attack moon took it through a gauntlet of Ork fire, the gunship's armor taking hits that would have destroyed a less robust craft. The pilot, demonstrating skill that bordered on the superhuman, threaded through the debris field surrounding Artemantua and made for the Imperial Fist's fleet elements that were already beginning their withdrawal from the system. The Space Marine vessels, their crews devastated by the realization of what had occurred, provided covering fire that allowed the Thunderhawk to reach safety. Captain Slaughter, standing in the gunship's troop bay surrounded by the bloodied survivors of his company, looked back at the attack moon that had become the tomb of his chapter, and understood that the Imperium faced a threat unlike anything it had confronted since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. The strategic withdrawal from the Artemantua system, proceeded in good order despite the catastrophic losses the Imperial fists had sustained. The chapter's fleet elements, still largely intact despite the loss of the cruisers, translated back into the warp and began the journey toward Terra. The survivors aboard those ships numbered fewer than 50 space marines from a chapter that had stood unbroken since the Emperor himself had founded it during the Unification Wars. The gene seed of the Fallen, that precious genetic material that would have allowed the chapter to rebuild, remained inside the bodies of dead battle brothers scattered throughout the attack moon's interior. The chapter's history, its traditions, and its honor survived in the memories of those who remained, but the Imperial fists as a fighting force had been effectively destroyed in a single disastrous engagement. The news of the Imperial fists' destruction reached Terra ahead of the survivors' astropathic messages transmitted by other Imperial forces in the region carrying word of the catastrophe. The High Lords of Terra received the reports with a shock that penetrated even their usual political detachment. A first founding chapter, one of the original 9 loyal legions that had fought at the Emperor's side during the Great Crusade, had been annihilated. The event was unprecedented in the 15 centuries since the Horus Heresy, a disaster that called into question fundamental assumptions about the Imperium's military capabilities and the superiority of the Adeptus Astartes. If a full chapter of Space Marines, led by an experienced chapter master and equipped with the finest weapons and armor the Imperium could provide, could be destroyed so completely, what hope did conventional Imperial forces have against this threat? The strategic implications of the Battle of Artamantua forced a complete reassessment of Imperial military doctrine regarding the Ork threat. The scattered reports and fragmentary intelligence that had characterized the early stages of the conflict could no longer be dismissed or downplayed. The Imperium faced an enemy that possessed technological capabilities matching or exceeding its own, that demonstrated strategic and tactical sophistication far beyond normal Ork behavior, and that could coordinate operations across multiple star systems with a unity of purpose that suggested genuine command and control rather than the typical greenskin chaos. The High Lords began issuing orders for a general mobilization, calling up guard regiments from across multiple sectors and dispatching requests to Space Marine chapters throughout the Imperium for whatever forces they could spare. Captain Slaughter, who would later be known by the name Corland after his elevation to chapter master of the rebuilt Imperial Fists, spent the journey back to Terra in a state that oscillated between numb shock and cold fury. He had watched his chapter die, had seen battle brothers he had served alongside for decades torn apart by Orks that should not have possessed the capabilities they demonstrated. The survivor's guilt that afflicted him was compounded by the knowledge that he would bear responsibility for explaining to the Imperium how the sons of Rogel Dorn had been defeated so completely. The other survivors of his company dealt with their trauma in their own ways, some retreating into meditation and prayer, others maintaining their weapons and equipment with an obsessive focus that kept their minds occupied. The Vox transmission that reached Terra from the outer system defenses carried a message that no one in the Senatorum Imperialis had believed possible. An attack moon had translated from the warp at the edge of the Sol system itself, its massive bulk registering on every auger array and sensor platform from Mars to the Kuiper Belt. The fortress moon that had destroyed Artamantua and annihilated the Imperial Fists now hung in the darkness beyond Neptune's orbit, its surface covered in the crude glyphs and totemic imagery that marked it as an Ork construct. The greenskins had brought war to humanity's birthplace, had breached defenses that had stood inviolate since Horus himself had led traitor legions against the Imperial Palace 15 centuries earlier. The initial response from the High Lords bordered on denial. Lord Commander Udin Macht Udo, who held supreme military authority over the Imperium's conventional forces, demanded confirmation and reconfirmation of the reports. The master of the administratum questioned whether sensor ghosts or equipment malfunction might explain the readings. The fabricator general of Mars, attending the emergency session via hololith projection, stated flatly that the data could not be an error given the number of independent sources reporting identical information. The attack moon was real, it was in the Sol system, and it was advancing toward the inner planets at a velocity that suggested it would reach Terra within weeks rather than months. The political machinery of the Imperium, which had operated through centuries of carefully balanced power arrangements and bureaucratic protocol, began to fracture under the pressure of an existential threat that demanded immediate action. The Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum argued for the immediate mobilization of every guard regiment within a dozen sectors and their deployment to Sol system. The Grand Master of Assassins suggested that specialized kill teams be dispatched to infiltrate the attack moon and eliminate its leadership. The Ecclesiarch called for a crusade to be declared and for the faithful across the galaxy to take up arms in defense of Holy Terra. Each High Lord advanced proposals based on their own institutional interests and areas of authority, and the resulting debate devolved into accusations and counter-accusations as the assembled leadership struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they faced. The Fabricator General withdrew Mars from direct cooperation with Terra's defense, planning within hours of the initial emergency session. The Tech Priests of the Red Planet, who maintained a relationship with Terra based on ancient treaties dating back to the Age of Strife, objected to what they perceived as the High Lord's attempts to commandeer Martian military assets without proper consultation. The Fabricator General made clear that Mars would defend itself using its own Skitarii legions and Titan forces, but that the Mechanicus would not subordinate its strategic planning to the Senatorum Imperialis. This fracture in the alliance between Terra and Mars, coming at the moment when unity was most critical, demonstrated how thoroughly the political structures of the Imperium had atrophied during the long centuries of relative peace. The Master of the Administratum, Jaskina Tull, found herself targeted by multiple High Lords who saw the Ork invasion as evidence of her department's failure to properly monitor and respond to threats along the Imperium's borders. The accusations had merit. Their Administratum's bureaucratic processes had indeed contributed to the delayed recognition of the danger the Orks posed. Tull defended her institution by pointing out that the military leadership had similarly failed to act on the intelligence that had been available, and that the Navy's reconnaissance efforts had been inadequate to detect the scale of the greenskin buildup. The resulting exchange of blame accomplished nothing except to further poison the already toxic atmosphere in the Senatorum chambers. Lord Commander Udin Makt Udo attempted to assert control over the situation by invoking his authority to declare a state of martial law across Terra and the Sol system. The proposal met immediate resistance from other High Lords who saw it as a power grab that would subordinate their own institutions to military authority. The Ecclesiarch argued that spiritual leadership was as important as military command in the face of Xeno's invasion. The inquisitorial representative pointed out that the Inquisition answered only to the Emperor and would not accept subordination to any mortal authority. The Grand Provost Marshal of the Adeptus Arbites stated that his organization would maintain order on Terra regardless of who claimed supreme command. The debate over command authority consumed hours that should have been spent coordinating defensive preparations. Captain Corland arrived at Terra aboard one of the surviving Imperial Fists vessels to find the throne world in a state of barely controlled chaos. The docking procedures at the orbital stations took longer than they should have as Navy personnel struggled with conflicting orders from different authorities. The transit from orbit to the surface revealed a planet mobilizing for war in a disorganized fashion that spoke to the lack of unified command. Troop ships crowded the approaches to Terra's spaceports, guard regiments arriving from across the segmentum in response to general mobilization orders. Civilian traffic competed with military vessels for docking space and transit corridors. The orbital defense platforms that ringed Terra in multiple layers showed signs of hasty reactivation, weapon systems that had been maintained in standby mode for centuries being brought online by crews who had never expected to fire them in anger. Corland's summons to appear before the High Lords came within hours of his arrival. The Senatorum Imperialis chamber, that vast space where the Imperium's leadership convened to debate policy and issue edicts, was filled with intention that the Space Marine could sense the moment he entered. The High Lords sat in their designated positions, each surrounded by advisors and attendants, their body language suggesting barely suppressed hostility toward one another. Corland, still wearing his battle plate stained with Ork blood and bearing the scars of the fighting inside the attack moon, presented himself as the ranking survivor of the Imperial Fists chapter and delivered his report on what had occurred at Ardamantua. The account of the chapter's destruction produced a silence in the chamber that lasted for several long moments after Corland finished speaking. The High Lords had received written reports and astropathic summaries, but hearing the details directly from a survivor who had witnessed the annihilation of a first founding chapter drove home the reality of what the Imperium faced. Lord Commander Yudo asked specific questions about Ork capabilities, weapons performance, and tactical coordination. The Fabricator General's hololith projection leaned forward as Corland described the technology he had observed inside the attack moon. The inquisitorial representative took notes on the descriptions of the massive Orks that had led the greenskin forces. The Grand Master of the Administratum attempted to use Corland's testimony to deflect blame from her institution, pointing out that military forces had failed to stop the Orks despite having been warned of the threat. Lord Commander Yudo responded by noting that the Administratum's failure to properly prioritize and communicate intelligence had contributed directly to the delayed military response. The exchange threatened to devolve into another round of accusations before the inquisitorial representative cut through the argument by stating the obvious. Assigning blame for past failures was less important than coordinating an effective defense of Terra against the attack moon currently advancing through the Sol system. Corland found himself elevated to a position of authority that should have been impossible for a mere captain, even one from a first founding chapter. The High Lords, desperate for someone with direct combat experience against the Orks, and recognizing that the surviving Imperial Fists represented a symbolic connection to the Imperium's martial traditions, appointed him Lord Commander of the Imperium with authority over all military forces in the Sol system. The appointment was made over the objections of multiple High Lords who saw it as an improper concentration of power, but Lord Commander Yudo supported the decision, and enough other members of the Senatorum voted in favor to make it official. Corland accepted the position with the understanding that he commanded in name only until he could demonstrate that the disparate Imperial forces could actually be coordinated into an effective defense. The mobilization of Terra's defenses revealed the extent to which the Throne World's military infrastructure had been allowed to decay during the long centuries since the Horus Heresy. The orbital defense platforms mounted weapons that were powerful enough to threaten battleships, but many of the systems had not been fired in decades, and crews had to work frantically to ensure they would function when needed. The ground-based defense lasers and missile silos that dotted Terra's surface were in varying states of readiness, some maintained by diligent garrison forces, and others neglected to the point where they required extensive repairs before they could be considered operational. The void shield generators that protected key installations, including the Imperial Palace itself, underwent emergency maintenance as tech priests discovered that components had degraded over time. The Imperial Palace, that vast complex that covered a significant portion of Terra's surface and housed the Golden Throne where the Emperor sat in eternal vigil, became the focus of defensive preparations. The walls that Rogaldorn himself had designed to withstand siege warfare still stood, their architecture incorporating principles of defense that remained valid 15 centuries after their construction. The Adeptus Custodes, those golden armored guardians who had protected the Emperor since the Unification Wars, emerged from the depths of the palace in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy. The Captain General of the Custodian Guard, whose name was not spoken outside the inner circles of the palace, met with Corland to coordinate the defense of the Throne World's most critical location. The Custodes who assembled for Terra's defense represented a fraction of the full strength of the organization, but even a few hundred of the Emperor's Guardians constituted a military force of significant capability. Each custodian was a warrior who had been crafted through processes that made the creation of a space marine seem crude by comparison, their bodies and minds enhanced to levels that approached the Primarchs themselves in capability, if not in raw power. They wore Oromite armor that was lighter and stronger than the ceramite plate of Space Marine power armor, and they carried Guardian spears and Sentinel blades that were master-crafted weapons incorporating technology that the Mechanicus could replicate but not truly understand. The Custodes had not deployed in significant numbers beyond the Imperial Palace since the dark days of the Heresy, and their appearance now signaled that the Imperium's leadership recognized the gravity of the threat. The Lucifer Blacks, an elite regiment of the Imperial army that traced its lineage back to the Unification Wars, deployed to reinforce key positions around the Imperial Palace and the Senatorum chambers. These soldiers wore black carapace armor and carried hellguns that fired with a precision that approached Space Marine standards. They had served as the personal guard of various High Lords and had maintained their training and readiness even as other Imperial army formations had been absorbed into the Astra Militarum or allowed to decline. The regiment numbered only a few thousand soldiers, but their quality and their symbolic importance as one of Terra's oldest military formations made them valuable both as fighters and as a rallying point for other forces. Space Marine chapters began arriving in the Sol system in response to the general call for aid that the High Lords had issued. The Fists Exemplar, who had already been operating in the region, brought their remaining forces to Terra. The Crimson Fists dispatched 2 companies under the command of a senior captain. The Black Templars, whose crusading fleets roamed the galaxy in perpetual warfare against the Imperium's enemies, redirected the nearest elements to Sol system. Other chapters sent whatever forces they could spare, individual squads or companies that arrived aboard strike cruisers, and offered their services to the defense of humanity's throne world. The total number of Space Marines available for Terra's defense reached approximately 3,000 warriors, a significant force but one that would be spread thin defending a planet and a system as vast as Sol. Courland established his command center in one of the Imperial Palace's secondary fortifications, a complex that had been designed during the Heresy to serve as a fallback position if the main walls were breached. The Space Marine found himself coordinating with officers and officials who had spent their entire careers navigating the political complexities of Terra's government rather than fighting wars. The Navy admirals who commanded the Sol system defense fleet operated under regulations and protocols that made rapid redeployment difficult. The Astra Militarum generals, who led the guard regiments arriving from across the segmentum, brought with them their own ideas about how best to employ their forces. The representatives from various Imperial institutions all demanded input into strategic planning based on their own institutional interests. The coordination challenges were compounded by the sheer scale of what needed to be defended. The Sol system contained not just Terra, but also Mars, the gas giants and their moons that hosted various Imperial installations, the asteroid belt mining operations that supplied raw materials to the inner system's industries, and the outer system monitoring stations that provided early warning of threats. The Navy had to position forces to protect all of these assets while maintaining a mobile reserve capable of responding to wherever the Orks chose to strike. The ground forces had to be distributed across multiple worlds and moons, with concentrations at the most critical locations, but enough flexibility to reinforce positions that came under attack. The attack moon continued its advance through the Sol system, its course taking it past the outer planets toward the inner system where Terra and Mars orbited. The Ork construct made no attempt at stealth or deception, its massive bulk visible to every sensor array in the system. Navy reconnaissance flights that approached within extreme weapons range reported that the attack moon's surface showed signs of recent construction, additional weapons emplacements, and launch bays that suggested the greenskins were continuing to modify and enhance their fortress even as it traveled through Imperial space. The gravitational distortions that the attack moon generated affected the orbits of smaller bodies it passed, asteroids and debris pulled toward the massive construct by forces that should not have been possible. The psychological impact of the attack moon's presence in the Sol system affected Terra's population in ways that the High Lords had not fully anticipated. The throne world's billions of citizens, who had lived their entire lives secure in the knowledge that Terra was the most heavily defended location in the galaxy, now faced the reality that an enemy had penetrated to humanity's birthplace. Riots broke out in several hive cities as citizens attempted to flee or fought over access to shelter. The Adeptus Arbites deployed in force to maintain order, their shock malls and riot shields restoring control through the application of overwhelming force. The ecclesiarchy organized prayer vigils and called upon the faithful to trust in the emperor's protection, but even the most devout could not entirely suppress the fear that came from knowing that Orks were approaching Terra itself. Corland spent his days moving between command centers, coordination meetings, and inspection tour of defensive positions. The Space Marine slept little, sustained by his enhanced physiology and driven by a determination to ensure that Terra would not fall as Artamantua had fallen. He met with Navy admirals to discuss fleet dispositions and void combat tactics. He consulted with Astra Militarum generals about ground defense plans and the establishment of fallback positions. He coordinated with the Captain General of the Custodian Guard regarding the defense of the Imperial Palace. He reviewed intelligence reports from inquisitors who were attempting to determine whether the attack moon was the only Ork asset in the system, or if additional threats might be approaching. The command structure that Corland attempted to impose on Terra's defenders faced constant challenges from the institutional rivalries and political considerations that had dominated Imperial governance for centuries. Navy officers objected to being placed under the operational command of an Astra Militarum general for joint operations. Space Marine captains from different chapters had to be carefully assigned to avoid conflicts based on ancient grudges or doctrinal differences. The representatives from Mars insisted on maintaining independent command of their own forces, even while coordinating with Terra's overall defense plan. Every decision required negotiation and compromise, and Corland found himself spending as much time managing the politics of command as actually planning military operations. The defensive preparations continued as the attack moon drew closer to Terra's orbit. The orbital defense platforms completed their reactivation and began running firing drills, their crews practicing the coordination that would be necessary to concentrate fire on priority targets. The ground forces dug in at key locations, establishing defensive lines and fortifying positions that controlled access to critical infrastructure. The civilian population was organized into labor battalions that worked to strengthen fortifications and prepare emergency shelters. The Mechanicus facilities on Terra and Mars operated at maximum capacity, producing ammunition and replacement parts for the weapon systems that would soon be tested in battle. The High Lords continued to meet in emergency sessions, their debates now focused on contingency planning for various disaster scenarios. What would happen if the attack moon's weapons proved capable of breaching Terra's orbital defenses? How would the Imperium function if the Senatorum Imperialis itself was destroyed? Who would assume command if the High Lords were killed? These questions, which should have been addressed centuries earlier as part of basic continuity planning, now had to be answered in the midst of a crisis. The resulting discussions revealed the extent to which the Imperium's leadership had failed to prepare for existential threats, had assumed that Terra's defenses and the Imperium's military might would always be sufficient to protect humanity's throne world from any conceivable danger. The ancient protocol that Captain Corland activated from deep within the Phalanx's data vaults had been established by Rogel Dorn himself in the aftermath of the Second Founding. The Primarch, recognizing that the fragmentation of his legion into separate chapters might one day leave Terra vulnerable if no concentrated Imperial Fist's force remained to defend it, had encoded a contingency plan into the gene memory of all his successors. The Last Wall Protocol called for every chapter descended from the Imperial Fists to unite in defense of humanity's throne world when the situation demanded it, to temporarily set aside their individual identities and reform as a single fighting force under unified command. The protocol had never been activated in the 15 centuries since its creation, existing only as a theoretical contingency that most chapter masters knew about, but never expected to invoke. Corlin transmitted the activation codes through astropathic channels and via encoded Vox messages carried by fast courier ships dispatched to every corner of the galaxy, where Imperial Fist's successor chapters maintained their fortress monasteries. The messages were brief and carried the full authority of the protocol itself, requiring no explanation beyond the simple statement that Terra faced an existential threat and that all sons of Dorn were called to its defense. The response came faster than anyone had anticipated, suggesting that the news of the Imperial Fist's destruction and the attack moon's presence in the Sol system had already reached many of the successor chapters through their own intelligence networks. The Fist's exemplar arrived first, their chapter having already been operating in Segmentum Obscurus when the Ork offensive began. Chapter Master Thane brought 6 companies to Terra, nearly 2/3 of his chapter's total strength, leaving only minimal forces to guard their fortress monastery and recruiting worlds. The Fist's exemplar had engaged Ork forces multiple times during the early stages of the invasion and had developed tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter the greenskins' improved coordination and technology. Thane himself was a warrior who had served for over 4 centuries, his experience spanning countless campaigns against every major threat the Imperium faced. He accepted Corlin's overall command without hesitation, recognizing that the Last Wall Protocol superseded normal chapter autonomy and that the defense of Terra required unified leadership. The Crimson Fists dispatched 4 companies under the command of Captain Casadra, a senior officer who had led his chapter's forces in void warfare operations for 2 centuries. The Crimson Fists specialized in naval boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat, their tactical expertise making them particularly valuable for operations against the attack moon and any Ork vessels that entered the Sol system. Casadra brought with him detailed intelligence his chapter had gathered about Ork ship construction and void combat capabilities, information compiled from engagements along the borders of their own operational area. The Crimson Fists had lost contact with their homeworld of Rin's world several weeks earlier, and Casadra made clear that his warriors fought with the desperation of space marines who understood their chapter might already be facing its own extinction. The Black Templars arrived in characteristic fashion, their crusade fleets translating from the warp at multiple points throughout the Sol system as different elements responded independently to the call. The Black Templars maintained no central fortress monastery and no fixed chapter organization, their forces scattered across the galaxy in perpetual crusades against the Imperium's enemies. The warriors who answered the Last Wall Protocol numbered approximately 800 space marines organized into multiple crusade companies, each led by a castellan or marshal who commanded independently. High Marshal Bohemond, the overall leader of the Black Templars, was not among those who arrived, his own crusade operating in a distant sector where news of Terra's peril had not yet reached him. The senior officer present was Marshal Magneric, who commanded the largest single crusade element and who assumed coordination responsibilities for all Black Templars forces in the system. The excoriators sent 3 companies led by Chapter Master Kirsch, their arrival delayed by warp storms that had made the journey from their home system longer and more dangerous than normal. The excoriators practiced a particularly harsh form of devotion that involved ritual scarification and pain tolerance trials, their chapter cult emphasizing suffering as a path to spiritual purity. Kirsch himself bore the scars of decades of such rituals, his face and exposed skin marked with the deliberate cuts that his chapter used to demonstrate their dedication to Dorn's memory. The excoriators brought with them a reputation for stubborn defensive warfare, their doctrine emphasizing holding ground regardless of casualties and refusing to yield positions once they had been established. The Soul Drinkers arrived with 2 companies, their chapter master having chosen to commit a significant portion of their strength to Terra's defense while maintaining sufficient forces to protect their own territories. The Soul Drinkers had a history of independent action and occasional friction with Imperial authorities, their chapter having been investigated by the Inquisition on multiple occasions for deviations from standard doctrine. Their presence at Terra represented both a response to the Last Wall Protocol and an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to the Imperium at a moment when such demonstrations carried significant weight. The Soul Drinkers specialized in close assault operations, their warriors favoring lightning claws and thunder hammers over the bolters that other chapters relied upon as primary weapons. The assembly of these forces in the Sol system created a concentration of space marine strength that had not been seen since the second founding. Nearly 3,000 warriors bearing the gene seed of Rogel Dorn gathered on Terra and aboard the Phalanx, their combined presence representing approximately 3 chapters' worth of combat power. The individual Space Marines maintained their chapter colors and heraldry, the Crimson Fists in their blue armor with red gauntlets, the Black Templars in their black and white plate, the Excoriators in their bone-colored ceramite, the Soul Drinkers in their purple and gold. The visual diversity reflected the centuries of separate development that had created distinct chapter identities from the original Imperial Fists Legion, each successor chapter having evolved its own traditions and aesthetic preferences. The political complications of reunifying forces that had operated independently for 15 centuries became apparent immediately. The chapter masters and senior captains, who gathered for the first coordination meeting, brought with them assumptions about command authority and operational doctrine that reflected their individual chapters' cultures. Thane of the Fists Exemplar argued for a centralized command structure with clear chains of authority, his chapter having maintained the most direct adherence to the organizational principles laid out in the Codex Astartes. Marshal Magneric of the Black Templars objected to any command arrangement that would subordinate his crusade companies to officers from other chapters, pointing out that the Black Templars had operated successfully for millennia without adhering to Codex organization and saw no reason to change their methods now. The question of overall command structure touched on fundamental tensions within the Space Marine chapters regarding the Codex Astartes itself. Robute Guilliman had written the Codex in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy as a comprehensive guide to Space Marine organization, tactics, and doctrine. Most chapters followed its principles closely, viewing the Codex as holy writ that encoded the wisdom of a Primarch. The Black Templars had explicitly rejected Codex organization from their founding, maintaining the Crusade-based structure that had characterized the Imperial Fists Legion during the Great Crusade. Other chapters had adopted modified versions of Codex doctrine, taking some principles while adapting others to suit their own circumstances and preferences. The attempt to create a unified command structure from these diverse organizational cultures required compromise and negotiation that consumed hours of meeting time. Corland resolved the command dispute by invoking the authority of the Last Wall Protocol itself, which specified that the senior surviving Imperial Fists officer would assume overall command of all successor chapter forces. His position as the ranking survivor of the original chapter, combined with his appointment as Lord Commander of the Imperium, gave him the legal authority to impose a command structure regardless of individual chapter preferences. The solution satisfied no one completely, but provided the framework necessary for coordinated operations. Corland established a command council consisting of the senior officers from each successor chapter, giving them input into strategic planning while maintaining his own authority to make final decisions. The practical integration of forces from different chapters revealed additional complications beyond command structure. Each chapter maintained its own supply chains, equipment standards, and tactical doctrines that had evolved over centuries of independent operations. The Crimson Fists used specialized boarding shields and breaching charges optimized for ship-to-ship combat, equipment that other chapters did not possess and did not train with. The Black Templars organized their forces around Crusade companies that were larger than standard Codex companies, and that included attached support elements that would normally be organized separately. The Excoriators employed combat doctrines that emphasized static defense and attritional warfare, approaches that conflicted with the more mobile tactics that other chapters preferred. The ammunition and equipment compatibility issues required immediate attention from the Techmarines responsible for maintaining each chapter's wargear. Bolter rounds were standardized across the Imperium, but the specialized ammunition types that different chapters preferred varied significantly. The Crimson Fists favored Kraken penetrator rounds for use against armored targets in void combat. The Soul Drinkers stockpiled Inferno rounds for close assault operations. The Black Templars used standard mass reactive rounds almost exclusively, their doctrine emphasizing reliability over specialization. The logistics officers had to coordinate supply distribution to ensure that each chapter received the ammunition types their tactical doctrines required, while maintaining sufficient reserves of standard rounds for general use. The vehicle and equipment pools presented similar challenges. Each chapter had brought their own Rhino transports, land raiders, and other armored vehicles, but the machine spirits of these vehicles had been consecrated by different Techmarines using rituals that varied between chapters. The Black Templars' vehicles bore purity seals and devotional inscriptions that reflected their chapter's zealous faith. The Excoriators' transports showed the wear and damage of centuries of hard use, their chapter believing that honorable scars should be maintained rather than repaired. The integration of these diverse vehicle pools into a unified motorized force required careful coordination to ensure that mixed units could operate effectively together. The formation of combined battle groups that drew Space Marines from multiple chapters created opportunities to leverage the specialized capabilities that each chapter brought to the overall force. Courland organized assault formations that paired Soul Drinkers, close combat specialists with Crimson Fists, who could provide supporting fire and tactical flexibility. Defensive positions were anchored by Excoriators who would hold ground regardless of casualties, supported by Fists Exemplar who could maneuver to counterattack any breakthrough. Black Templars' Crusade companies were assigned to mobile reserve roles, where their aggressive doctrine and independent command structure could be employed most effectively. The combined training exercises that Courland ordered revealed both the potential and the limitations of the unified force. Space Marines from different chapters who had never fought together struggled initially with coordination and communication. The Black Templars' preference for aggressive frontal assaults conflicted with the Fists, Exemplar's more methodical approach to combat. The Excoriators' willingness to accept heavy casualties in exchange for holding positions disturbed officers from chapters that emphasized tactical flexibility and preservation of combat power. The Soul Drinkers' focus on close combat sometimes left them unsupported when other chapters expected them to maintain firing positions. The gradual improvement in coordination came through the shared gene seed that linked all the successor chapters to their common Primarch. The Sons of Dorn, regardless of which chapter they served, shared certain psychological traits and combat preferences that had been encoded in their genetic heritage. They favored defensive warfare and siege operations, showed particular aptitude for fortification construction and breaching operations, and demonstrated the stubborn refusal to yield that had characterized Rogel Dorn himself. These common traits provided a foundation for cooperation that transcended the organizational and doctrinal differences between chapters. Space Marines who might have struggled to coordinate with warriors from other Primarch lineages found that working with fellow Sons of Dorn felt natural, despite the centuries of separate development. The strategic planning sessions that Courland convened brought together tactical expertise from across the successor chapters, creating a collective knowledge base that exceeded what any single chapter could have provided. The Crimson Fists contributed their experience with void warfare and boarding actions. The Black Templars offered insights into sustained offensive operations and the maintenance of combat effectiveness during extended campaigns. The Excoriators provided expertise in defensive warfare and the establishment of fortified positions. The Fists Exemplar brought their adherence to Codex doctrine and their experience coordinating with other Imperial forces. The Soul Drinkers contributed their knowledge of close assault tactics and urban warfare. The combined force developed battle plans that incorporated these diverse capabilities into comprehensive strategies for defending Terra against the approaching attack moon. The Void Warfare component would be led by Crimson Fist's officers who understood ship-to-ship combat, with support from other chapters providing boarding parties and assault elements. The ground defense would be anchored by excoriators holding key positions, with Fist's Exemplar and other chapters providing mobile reserves capable of responding to breakthroughs. The Black Templars would operate as rapid reaction forces, their Crusade companies positioned to counterattack wherever the Orks achieved local superiority. The Soul Drinkers would be held in reserve for close assault operations against any Ork forces that breached the primary defensive lines. The political implications of the Last Wall Protocol's activation extended beyond the immediate military benefits of unified command. The High Lords of Terra watched the gathering of successor chapters with a mixture of relief and concern, grateful for the additional military capability, but troubled by the precedent being established. The Codex Astartes had been written specifically to prevent the concentration of Space Marine power under single commanders, the fragmentation of the legions, intended to ensure that no future Warmaster could command the kind of forces that Horus had wielded. The Last Wall Protocol represented a deliberate exception to this principle, a contingency that Rogel Dorn had encoded despite knowing that it contradicted the spirit, if not the letter, of Guilliman's reforms. The Master of the Administratum raised concerns in private High Lord sessions about the long-term implications of allowing Space Marine chapters to unite under emergency protocols. If the precedent was established that successor chapters could reform into Legion-strength forces whenever they deemed circumstances sufficiently dire, what would prevent such reunifications from occurring more frequently? The Lord Commander Militant countered that the immediate threat to Terra justified any measures necessary for its defense, and that theoretical concerns about future abuse of the protocol were less important than surviving the current crisis. The debate reflected the fundamental tension between the Imperium's need for concentrated military power and its fear of allowing any single commander to wield the kind of authority that had enabled the Horus Heresy. The inquisitorial representative observed the reunification with particular interest, recognizing that the Last Wall Protocol represented a potential template for other Legion successors. If the Sons of Dorn could unite in Terra's defense, what would prevent the Ultramarines and their successors from invoking similar protocols, the Blood Angels and their successors? The Space Wolves, who had never fully accepted the Second Founding and maintained a chapter strength far above the Codex-mandated 1,000 warriors. The possibility that multiple Legion lineages might simultaneously invoke reunification protocols created scenarios that troubled those responsible for monitoring threats to Imperial stability. The training and coordination efforts continued as the attack moon drew closer to Terra's orbit, the combined successor chapter force gradually developing the cohesion necessary for effective large-scale operations. The Space Marines conducted joint exercises that simulated void combat boarding actions, defensive operations against overwhelming numbers, and rapid redeployment between threatened positions. The exercises revealed continuing friction points between chapters, but also demonstrated steady improvement in coordination and mutual understanding. The warriors involved recognized that their survival and Terra's defense depended on their ability to function as a unified force, rather than as separate chapters operating in proximity. The symbolic importance of the reunification resonated beyond its immediate military value. The gathering of the successor chapters represented a tangible connection to the Imperium's founding, a reminder that the Space Marines had once fought as legions under the direct command of the Primarchs and the Emperor himself. The citizens of Terra, who witnessed Space Marines from multiple chapters operating together, saw evidence that the Imperium could still summon the unity and strength that had characterized the Great Crusade. The propaganda value of this perception was not lost on the ecclesiarchy, which organized public ceremonies and prayer services that emphasized the theme of humanity united against Xeno's threats. The chapter masters and senior officers who led the successor chapters understood that the Last Wall Protocol represented both an opportunity and a test. If the unified force succeeded in defending Terra and defeating the Ork threat, it would validate Rogal Dorn's wisdom in establishing the contingency plan and might lead to similar protocols being developed for other Legion lineages. If the reunification failed, if the combined chapters proved unable to coordinate effectively or were defeated despite their united strength, it would demonstrate the wisdom of maintaining chapter independence and would likely result in the Last Wall Protocol being abandoned or significantly modified. The intelligence that reached Terra through a combination of inquisitorial sources and captured Ork communications carried information that transformed the entire strategic understanding of the threat the Imperium faced. The greenskins had not simply chosen random systems for their expansion or selected targets based on opportunistic raiding patterns. The Orks had established their primary stronghold on Ulanor, a world whose name carried significance that resonated through 15 centuries of Imperial history. Ulanor was the planet where the Emperor himself had achieved his greatest triumph against the greenskin species during the Great Crusade, where the largest Ork empire ever recorded had been shattered by the combined might of multiple Space Marine legions, where Horus had been elevated to the rank of War Master in recognition of his role in that victory. The choice of Ulanor as the center of the new Ork empire could not have been coincidental. The world lay in Segmentum Obscurus, relatively close to the outer regions where the greenskin offensive had begun, but thousands of other worlds in that sector would have served equally well as administrative centers or fortress worlds. The specific selection of Ulanor suggested that the Orks, or more precisely the beasts who commanded them, possessed knowledge of what had occurred there during the Great Crusade. The greenskins should not have retained such historical memory. Ork society typically operated on timescales measured in generations at most, with knowledge and culture transmitted through genetic memory and the collective psychic field rather than through written records or oral traditions. The fact that the Orks had returned to Ulanor and made it their throne world indicated something fundamental about the nature of the beasts themselves. The Inquisitors who analyzed this information consulted with the most ancient records available in the Imperial archives, data stacks that dated back to the Great Crusade itself, and that had been sealed in the deepest vaults of the Administratum. The accounts of the Ulanor campaign described an Ork empire that had controlled hundreds of systems and fielded armies numbering in the billions. The greenskin warlord who had commanded that empire, whose name had been deliberately expunged from most records, had been a creature of such size and power that it had required the personal intervention of the Emperor to ensure its defeat. The Imperium had deployed multiple Legion-strength forces to Ulanor, their combined assault reducing the Ork strongholds to rubble and scattering the surviving greenskins across dozens of systems, where they could be hunted down and exterminated over the following decades. The parallels between the historical Ulanor campaign and the current situation were disturbing enough that several Inquisitors suggested the possibility that the beasts represented some form of reincarnation or genetic memory manifestation of that ancient warlord. The Ork species reproduced through spores rather than conventional biological processes, their genetic material spreading through fungal growth that could lie dormant for extended periods before producing new Orks. The theory proposed that the spores from the original Ulanor warlord might have remained viable in the planet's ecosystem, that some fragment of that ancient creature's genetic material had survived and had now produced the beasts who commanded the current Ork empire. The mechanism by which such genetic memory could transmit specific historical knowledge remained unclear, but the alternative explanation, that the Orks had simply coincidentally chosen Ulanor, strained credibility even further. The reconnaissance missions that the Imperium dispatched to gather intelligence about Ulanor and the surrounding systems faced challenges that went beyond the normal difficulties of operating in Ork-controlled space. The greenskins had established a defensive perimeter around their core territories that extended across multiple star systems, patrol fleets, and monitoring stations that detected Imperial vessels long before they could achieve useful sensor range of priority targets. The Ork forces demonstrated coordination in their patrol patterns that suggested actual strategic planning rather than random deployment, their ships positioned to provide overlapping coverage and mutual support. Imperial scout vessels that attempted to penetrate this defensive screen found themselves intercepted by Ork forces that responded with a speed and precision that should not have been possible without sophisticated communications and command systems. The intelligence that did reach Imperial analysts came from multiple sources, each providing fragmentary information that had to be assembled into a comprehensive picture through careful analysis and correlation. Rogue trader vessels operating along the borders of Ork-controlled space reported massive increases in shipping traffic. Ork transport ships moving between systems in convoys that suggested organized logistics networks. Inquisitorial agents who had managed to infiltrate the outer systems before they fell completely under greenskin control transmitted reports of industrial construction on a scale that rivaled major Imperial Forge worlds. Astropathic reconnaissance, dangerous in the extreme due to the psychic pressure that the beasts generated, detected Wa energy signatures emanating from Ulenar itself with an intensity that suggested the presence of multiple prime Orks rather than a single supreme warlord. The picture that emerged from this intelligence described an Ork empire that had transformed Ulenar into something approaching a proper capital world rather than simply a military stronghold. The planet's surface had been covered in construction that combined the crude aesthetics of Ork architecture with a level of organization and planning that suggested actual urban design principles. Massive structures that appeared to serve as palaces or government buildings dominated key locations, their construction incorporating looted Imperial materials and technology alongside Ork-manufactured components. Industrial complexes surrounded these administrative centers, factories and foundries that produced weapons, vehicles, and ships in quantities sufficient to supply the Ork forces operating across hundreds of systems. The scale of the Ork population on Ulenar and the surrounding systems defied easy calculation. Conservative estimates based on observed ship traffic and industrial output suggested billions of greenskins, a population density that approached or exceeded major Imperial hive worlds. The Orks had apparently established breeding grounds or spore cultivation facilities across multiple planets. Their reproductive cycle accelerated through methods that might have involved deliberate manipulation of the fungal growth process. The speed with which the Ork population had grown from whatever initial force had established itself in the region indicated either that massive numbers of greenskins had migrated to Ulenar from other regions, or that the beasts had discovered methods to accelerate Ork reproduction beyond its normal already rapid pace. The military forces that the Orks had concentrated around Ulenar represented the largest greenskin army ever observed by Imperial intelligence in the 15 centuries since the original Ulenar campaign. Multiple attack moons orbited the planet or held positions in nearby systems, their presence creating a defensive network that would make any assault on Ulenar itself extraordinarily costly. Ork warfleets patrolled the approaches to the system in strength that matched or exceeded the naval forces that major Imperial sectors could deploy. Ground forces numbering in the hundreds of millions garrisoned the planet itself, their equipment and organization suggesting that they represented elite formations rather than the typical Ork mobs that made up the bulk of greenskin armies. The intelligence regarding the beasts themselves remained fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but certain facts emerged with sufficient consistency to be considered reliable. Multiple prime Orks operated from Ulenar, their number estimated at 6 based on psychic reconnaissance and intercepted Ork communications that referenced different beasts by what appeared to be individual designations. Each beast commanded its own forces and controlled its own territory within the broader Ork Empire, but they coordinated their actions with a unity of purpose that suggested either a council structure or some form of psychic coordination that transcended normal Ork command relationships. The beasts themselves rarely left Ulenar, their presence on the planet apparently serving some function beyond simple military command. The most disturbing intelligence concerned the palace fortress that the Orks had constructed on Ulanr's surface, a massive complex that appeared to serve as both a military headquarters and a seat of government. The structure incorporated architectural elements that parodied Imperial design, crude imitations of the columns, arches, and fortifications that characterized major Imperial buildings. The palace contained chambers that appeared designed for administrative functions rather than purely military purposes, spaces where Ork bureaucrats, if such a concept could be applied to greenskins, managed the logistics and coordination of the empire. The existence of such facilities suggested that the Orks had developed governmental structures that went beyond the typical warlord-dominated hierarchy that characterized greenskin society. The revelation that Ork ambassadors had actually traveled to Terra, carrying an ultimatum from the beasts, represented perhaps the most shocking piece of intelligence that Imperial authorities received. The ambassadors had arrived aboard an Ork vessel that had somehow penetrated the Sol system's outer defenses without being destroyed, had transmitted demands for an audience with Imperial leadership, and had delivered a message that called for the Imperium's complete surrender to Ork authority. The ambassadors themselves were massive greenskins that stood taller than space marines, their armor incorporating what appeared to be ceremonial elements alongside functional protection. They spoke Low Gothic with an accent, but with grammatical correctness that suggested actual language instruction rather than the pidgin that most Orks used when communicating with humans. The content of the ultimatum the ambassadors delivered demonstrated the extent to which the beasts understood Imperial governmental structure and political organization. The message addressed the High Lords of Terra by their correct titles, referenced specific Imperial institutions and their functions, and outlined demands that showed comprehension of how the Imperium's administrative systems operated. The Orks demanded that the Imperium acknowledge the beasts' sovereignty over the territories they had conquered, that Imperial forces withdraw from all systems within a specified region of Segmentum Obscurus, and that the High Lords send their own ambassadors to Ulanr to negotiate the terms of humanity's subordination to Ork authority. The language used in the ultimatum, while crude in places, followed diplomatic conventions that suggested the Orks had studied Imperial governmental communications. The High Lord's response to the Ork ambassadors involved their immediate execution, the greenskins killed by Adeptus Custodes, who had been assigned to ensure that the Xenos did not pose a direct threat to Terra's leadership. The decision to kill the ambassadors rather than simply refusing their demands and sending them away reflected the fury and humiliation that the High Lords felt at being addressed as if they were the representatives of a defeated power. The execution also served a practical purpose, preventing the ambassadors from returning to Ulanr with intelligence about Terra's defenses and the state of Imperial preparations. The bodies of the ambassadors were turned over to the Inquisition for examination, the Ordo Xenos eager to learn whatever could be discovered from studying prime Ork physiology. The examination of the dead ambassadors revealed biological characteristics that differed significantly from standard Ork physiology. The creature's musculature was denser than typical greenskins, their skeletal structure reinforced with what appeared to be naturally occurring metallic compounds that made their bones nearly as strong as plasteel. Their brains showed development in regions associated with higher cognitive functions, physical evidence of the intelligence that the ambassadors had demonstrated in their communications. Most significantly, the genetic analysis revealed markers that suggested these Orks represented a reversion toward the ancient Krork phenotype, the original warrior constructs that the Old Ones had created during the war in heaven. The implications of this finding supported the theory that the beasts represented some form of genetic throwback, Orks that had somehow accessed genetic potential that had been dormant in their species for millions of years. The strategic analysis that Imperial military planners conducted based on the Ulanr intelligence painted a grim picture of what would be required to defeat the Ork Empire. Any assault on Ulanr itself would require forces comparable to what the Emperor had deployed during the Great Crusade, multiple Legion strength formations, supported by massive naval assets and Titan legions. The Imperium in the 32nd millennium could not easily assemble such forces. the fragmentation of the Space Marine legions, and the dispersal of Imperial military assets across a million worlds, making it difficult to concentrate the necessary strength without leaving other regions vulnerable. The attack moons that defended Ulanor would have to be neutralized before ground forces could be deployed, a task that would require naval superiority that the Imperium currently did not possess in the region. The political implications of the Ulanor revelation extended beyond immediate military concerns. The fact that the Orks had chosen to establish their capital on the world, where the Emperor had achieved his greatest triumph against their species, carried symbolic weight that could not be ignored. The greenskins were not simply raiding Imperial territory or establishing a typical Wa that would eventually burn itself out. They were deliberately challenging the Imperium's historical narrative, claiming for themselves a world that represented one of humanity's greatest victories, and transforming it into the center of an empire that threatened to reverse everything the Great Crusade had accomplished. The psychological impact of this challenge affected Imperial morale in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The ecclesiarchy seized upon the Ulanor revelation as evidence that the Imperium faced a test of faith as much as a military threat. Preachers across Terra and throughout nearby systems delivered sermons that portrayed the Ork occupation of Ulanor as a desecration that demanded holy retribution. The comparison to the Horus Heresy became explicit in these religious narratives, the current crisis framed as another moment when the Imperium's survival depended on the faithful standing firm against enemies who sought to undo the Emperor's work. The religious fervor that these sermons generated contributed to recruitment for the Astra Militarum and helped maintain civilian morale, but it also created expectations that the Imperium would mount a crusade to reclaim Ulanor regardless of the military practicalities involved. The intelligence officers responsible for tracking Ork movements and predicting their strategic intentions struggled to develop reliable assessments based on the Ulanor information. Traditional analysis methods that worked for typical Ork Was proved inadequate when applied to an enemy that demonstrated strategic patience and long-term planning. The Orks were not simply gathering strength for a massive assault, they were building infrastructure, establishing governmental systems, and creating an empire that could sustain itself indefinitely. The timeline for when the greenskins might launch their next major offensive remained unclear, the beasts apparently content to consolidate their control over conquered territories, while continuing to expand gradually into adjacent systems. The comparison between the current Ork Empire and the one that had existed on Ulanor during the Great Crusade revealed both similarities and differences that complicated strategic planning. The historical Ork Empire had been larger in terms of total systems controlled, but it had been less organized and had lacked the technological sophistication that the current greenskin forces demonstrated. The Emperor had been able to defeat the historical Ork Empire through a combination of overwhelming force and the elimination of its central leadership, the death of the Supreme Warlord causing the entire structure to collapse into infighting and chaos. The current Ork Empire, with multiple beasts apparently sharing authority, might prove more resilient to decapitation strikes, the surviving beasts potentially able to maintain cohesion even if one or more were killed. The Ork kill team that infiltrated the Imperial Palace during the ambassador visit represented a security failure so profound that its full implications would not be understood for weeks. The greenskin ambassadors had arrived aboard their vessel with what Imperial security forces assumed was a standard diplomatic entourage, guards and attendants that any delegation would reasonably include. The Adeptus Custodes, who oversaw security protocols, had screened the Ork vessel for weapons and explosives, had monitored the ambassadors themselves with auger arrays capable of detecting concealed armaments, and had established security perimeters that should have prevented any hostile action within the palace grounds. The procedures followed established protocols that had been refined over millennia, security measures that had successfully prevented assassination attempts by far more sophisticated enemies than Orks were believed capable of fielding. The kill team had apparently been concealed within the Ork vessel itself, hidden in shielded compartments that Imperial scans had not penetrated or had dismissed as mechanical spaces. The greenskins emerged after the ambassadors had been granted entry to the palace complex, their timing suggesting either remarkable coordination or some form of communication that Imperial security had failed to detect. The Orks moved through the palace with a precision that indicated detailed knowledge of its layout, avoiding the most heavily guarded corridors and targeting specific locations where high lords and senior officials were known to gather. They wore armor that incorporated stealth technology, chameleonic plates that bent light around them and made them difficult to detect visually or through standard auger scans. The attack occurred in the Senatorum chambers themselves, during an emergency session where the High Lords had gathered to discuss the Ork ultimatum and the broader strategic situation. The kill team breached the chamber through maintenance tunnels that should have been sealed and monitored, but which had apparently been compromised through methods that subsequent investigation would fail to determine conclusively. The Orks carried weapons that combined the crude aesthetics of greenskin manufacture with lethality that exceeded standard Imperial assassination equipment. Specialized bolters fired rounds that could penetrate even the best personal armor. Power claws had been modified for quick kills rather than the sustained combat that Orks typically favored, and each member of the kill team wore suicide charges that would detonate if they were killed or captured. The Adeptus Custodes responded within seconds of the breach, their enhanced reflexes and perpetual vigilance allowing them to engage the Orks before the greenskins could complete their primary objectives. The fighting inside the Senatorum chambers was brief and extraordinarily violent, the confined space filled with bolter fire and the clash of power weapons against Ork armor. The custodians killed most of the Ork kill team, their guardian spears and sentinel blades cutting through greenskin flesh with the precision that came from millennia of training. The suicide charges that several Orks detonated created additional casualties, the explosions designed to maximize fragmentation damage in enclosed spaces. The Custodes suffered losses that shocked an organization that rarely experienced casualties. 3 of the Emperor's guardians killed by Ork weapons or caught in the blast radius of the suicide charges. The High Lords present in the chamber during the attack fared far worse. The Master of the Administratum died in the initial seconds, her body torn apart by bolter fire before her security detail could interpose themselves. The Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum took a power claw strike that severed him at the waist, his enhanced physiology keeping him conscious long enough to witness his own death. The Ecclesiarch survived the initial assault, but was caught in one of the suicide explosions, his body so badly damaged that he died before Medicae personnel could reach him. The Fabricator General's hololith projection simply cut out when the chamber systems were damaged, but subsequent communication with Mars revealed that the tech priest had survived only because he had been attending remotely rather than in person. The Grand Provost Marshal of the Adeptus Arbites died defending other High Lords, his carapace armor insufficient to stop the specialized rounds the Orks fired. The final casualty count from what would become known as the beheading reached 7 High Lords dead, with 3 others seriously wounded and requiring extensive medical treatment that would keep them incapacitated for months. The Lord Commander Militant survived with minor injuries, having been positioned near the chamber entrance where custodian response was fastest. The inquisitorial representative escaped harm entirely, her position in the gallery above the main floor placing her outside the kill team's immediate target zone. The Master of the Astronomician, whose presence at the session had been required to discuss astropathic communications issues, took wounds that would have killed a normal human, but which his psychically enhanced physiology allowed him to survive. The other High Lords who had been present either lay dead or were so badly injured that their ability to resume their duties remained in question. The political vacuum that opened in the wake of the beheading created a crisis that threatened to paralyze Imperial governance at the moment when unified leadership was most critical. The Senatorum Imperialis, that vast parliamentary body representing worlds across the Imperium, descended into chaos as different factions attempted to position themselves to fill the empty seats on the High Lords' Council. the Adeptus Mechanicus immediately nominated candidates to replace the dead Fabricator General's representative, despite the fact that the actual Fabricator General on Mars had survived and the position should not have been vacant. The Ecclesiarchy's cardinals began maneuvering to ensure that the next ecclesiarch would come from their preferred faction within the church hierarchy. The Astra Militarum's senior generals argued over who should assume the position of Lord Commander, their debate complicated by questions about whether military necessity demanded immediate appointment or whether proper procedures should be followed regardless of the crisis. The Adeptus Custodes launched an investigation into how the Ork kill team had penetrated palace security, their inquiry revealing failures at multiple levels of the defensive systems. The maintenance tunnels that the Orks had used to reach the Senatorum chambers had been scheduled for security upgrades that had been delayed due to bureaucratic complications and resource allocation disputes. The auger arrays that should have detected the concealed compartments in the Ork vessel had been operating with degraded sensitivity due to maintenance that had been deferred. The security protocols themselves had not been updated to account for the enhanced capabilities that the new Ork forces demonstrated, the procedures based on assumptions about greenskin technological limitations that were no longer valid. The investigation's findings pointed toward systemic negligence rather than deliberate sabotage, but the result was the same regardless of intent. Draken Vangorich, Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, emerged as one of the few High Lords who had not been present during the attack and who possessed both the authority and the ruthlessness necessary to impose order on the deteriorating political situation. The Officio Assassinorum operated as one of the Imperium's most secretive institutions, its agents deployed to eliminate threats that could not be addressed through conventional military means. Vangorich himself was a figure who rarely appeared in public, his position as Grand Master requiring him to oversee operations across the entire galaxy while maintaining the secrecy that allowed his organization to function effectively. His survival of the beheading was not coincidental. The Grand Master had been conducting business at the Officio's fortress on Terra rather than attending the Senatorum session, his absence from High Lords meetings being sufficiently routine that it had not attracted particular notice. Vangorich's assessment of the political situation led him to conclude that the Imperium could not afford the months or years of debate and maneuvering that would normally accompany the replacement of multiple High Lords. The Ork threat demanded immediate action and unified command, neither of which would be possible if the Senatorum Imperialis descended into extended power struggles. The Grand Master began using the resources of the Officio Assassinorum to influence the succession process, his agents gathering intelligence on potential candidates and identifying those who would be most effective in their positions versus those who sought power for personal or factional gain. The methods Vangorich employed operated in the shadows of Imperial politics, quiet conversations and subtle pressures that shaped outcomes without leaving obvious traces. The first appointments that filled the vacant High Lord's positions came through processes that appeared legitimate on the surface, but which Vangorich had carefully orchestrated. The new Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum was a general who had distinguished himself in campaigns against Ork forces, and who possessed the tactical experience necessary to coordinate the Imperium's military response. The new ecclesiarch came from a moderate faction within the church that prioritized practical support for military operations over theological disputes. The Master of the Administratum's replacement was a senior official who understood logistics and resource allocation, skills that would be critical for sustaining extended military campaigns. Each appointment was ratified by the Senatorum Imperialis through votes that Vangorich's agents had ensured would produce the desired outcomes. The Grand Master's manipulation of the succession process extended beyond simply ensuring competent individuals filled the vacant positions. Vangorich used the crisis to eliminate officials and administrators who he deemed corrupt, incompetent, or likely to obstruct necessary military preparations. Assassins from the various temples of the Officio conducted operations that removed these obstacles, their deaths arranged to appear as accidents, natural causes, or casualties of the general chaos that gripped Terra in the wake of the beheading. The scale of this purge remained hidden from public view, but within the upper levels of Imperial governance, officials who might have opposed Vangorich's agenda found themselves either dead or suddenly cooperative, as they recognized the danger of resistance. The political maneuvering occurred against the backdrop of continuing military preparations as the attack moon drew closer to Terra's orbit. The forces that Courland commanded had to operate without clear direction from the High Lords during the weeks when the succession process unfolded, the military leadership making decisions based on their own judgment rather than waiting for guidance from political authorities who were too busy fighting over power to provide strategic direction. This period of de facto military autonomy established precedents that would shape Imperial governance long after the immediate crisis passed, the generals and admirals discovering that they could function effectively without constant oversight from civilian leadership. The Inquisition moved to fill part of the vacuum left by the decimated High Lords, inquisitors from all three major ordos asserting their authority to investigate and act against threats to the Imperium. The Ordo Xenos took primary responsibility for intelligence gathering regarding the Ork forces, their agents working to penetrate greenskin-controlled systems and gather information about enemy capabilities and intentions. The Ordo Hereticus focused on maintaining internal security, their operatives watching for signs of panic or sedition among Terra's population. The Ordo Malleus maintained its vigil against demonic threats, concerned that the chaos and fear generated by the Ork invasion might create conditions favorable for warp incursions. The Inquisition's activities operated largely independent of the High Lords, the organization's authority deriving directly from the Emperor and not requiring validation from temporal authorities. The Adeptus Mechanicus used the political chaos on Terra to assert greater independence for Mars, the Fabricator General making clear that the Red Planet would coordinate its own defense and would not subordinate Martian military assets to Terra's command structure without explicit agreements that respected Mechanicus autonomy. This position created practical complications for unified defense planning, as Mars controlled significant military resources, including Skitarii legions, Titan forces, and naval assets that would be critical for defending the Sol system. Courland found himself negotiating with Mechanicus representatives to establish coordination protocols that satisfied Martian concerns about autonomy, while ensuring that their forces could be integrated into the overall defensive strategy. The common citizens of Terra experienced the political upheaval through its effects on daily life rather than through direct knowledge of High Lords' politics. The increased military presence throughout the throne world, the accelerated fortification construction, and the visible preparations for siege warfare created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the ecclesiarchy and administratum struggled to manage. Ration systems were implemented to ensure adequate supplies for both military forces and civilian population, the distribution network straining under demands that exceeded peacetime capacity. The Arbites maintained order through increased patrols and harsh enforcement of regulations, their presence in the hive cities becoming more visible as authorities worried about riots or panic. Vangorich's consolidation of power continued as he maneuvered to have himself appointed to one of the vacant High Lord's positions, his nomination coming through channels that made it appear as if others had suggested him, rather than the Grand Master having orchestrated his own elevation. The Senatorum Imperialis ratified his appointment with little debate, the representatives either genuinely believing that Vangorich's experience and capabilities made him the logical choice or recognizing that opposing him would be dangerous given the resources he commanded. The Grand Master's ascension to the High Lord's Council gave him direct authority over Imperial policy rather than simply influence exercised through shadows, his position allowing him to openly advocate for the ruthless measures he believed necessary for the Imperium's survival. The military implications of the beheading extended beyond the immediate political chaos to to affect strategic planning and operational coordination. The death of the Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum had severed command relationships that had taken years to establish, the new commander inheriting a position without the personal relationships and institutional knowledge that his predecessor had accumulated. Naval officers who had been accustomed to receiving direction from specific high lords now found themselves reporting to individuals they had never worked with, the transition creating friction and delays as new working relationships developed. The Space Marine chapters operating in the Sol system maintained their independence from these political complications, but they still required coordination with Imperial Navy and Astra Militarum forces, coordination that became more difficult as command structures shifted. Corlin's position as Lord Commander of the Imperium gave him authority that theoretically superseded the normal command hierarchy, but the practical exercise of that authority required cooperation from institutions that jealously guarded their independence. The Adeptus Mechanicus would not accept direct orders from a Space Marine regarding the deployment of their forces. The Inquisition operated according to its own priorities and would coordinate with military command when it chose to do so, but would not subordinate itself to temporal authority. The various branches of the Astra Militarum maintained their own internal hierarchies and command structures that predated Corlin's appointment, and that continued to function according to established procedures. The Lord Commander found himself spending as much time negotiating and coordinating with these various institutions as actually planning military operations. The intelligence regarding Ulaner and the broader Ork Empire informed the strategic debates that occurred among the surviving and newly appointed High Lords. Some argued that the Imperium should focus entirely on defending Terra and the Sol system, that attempting offensive operations against Ulaner would be premature until the immediate threat had been addressed. Others contended that a purely defensive posture would allow the Orks to continue expanding and consolidating their empire, that the Imperium needed to take the fight to Ulaner before the greenskins grew even stronger. Vangorich advocated for a middle approach, defending Terra while simultaneously preparing strike forces that could conduct raids against Ork infrastructure and supply lines, operations designed to disrupt greenskin coordination without committing to a full-scale assault on their capital world. The military forces available for offensive operations remained limited despite the mobilization efforts that had been underway since the Ork threat became apparent. The Space Marine chapters that had answered the Last Wall Protocol were committed to Terra's defense and could not be easily redeployed without leaving the throne world vulnerable. The Astra Militarum regiments arriving in the Sol system required time to organize and equip before they could be considered combat ready for operations in Ork-controlled space. The Imperial Navy had sufficient ships to defend the Sol system or to conduct offensive operations, but not both simultaneously, forcing difficult choices about force allocation. The strategic situation demanded that the Imperium fight a defensive war while maintaining offensive capabilities, a balance that strained resources and command attention. The propaganda efforts that the Ecclesiarchy and Administratum conducted attempted to maintain morale among both military forces and civilian population by emphasizing the Imperium's historical victories and the Emperor's protection. Preachers delivered sermons that compared the current crisis to challenges the Imperium had overcome in the past, framing the Ork invasion as a test of faith that humanity would pass through devotion and sacrifice. The Administratum released carefully edited information about military preparations and defensive capabilities, reports designed to reassure the population that Terra's defenses were strong and that the High Lords had the situation under control. The reality that the political leadership had been decimated and that the military situation remained precarious was carefully omitted from public communications. The period following the beheading established patterns of governance that would persist long after the immediate crisis passed. The concentration of power in the hands of individuals like Vangorich, who were willing to act decisively and ruthlessly. The increased autonomy of military commanders, who operated without constant political oversight, and the assertion of institutional independence by organizations like the Mechanicus and Inquisition all represented shifts away from the centralized but fractured authority structure that had characterized imperial governance before the Ork invasion. These changes occurred not through deliberate reform, but through the practical necessities of responding to an existential threat, the Imperium's governmental systems adapting to crisis conditions in ways that would prove difficult to reverse once the emergency ended. The strategic calculus that drove the decision to assault Ulanor directly emerged from a recognition that purely defensive operations would not defeat an enemy that demonstrated the organizational capacity and strategic patience that the Orks now possessed. The attack moon threatening Terra represented only one component of a broader greenskin empire that controlled hundreds of systems and possessed the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the Imperium could inflict them. Courland and the reconstituted High Lords understood that eliminating the beasts themselves offered the only realistic path to collapsing the Ork Empire before it grew too powerful to defeat through any means available to the Imperium. The original Ulanor campaign during the Great Crusade had required the Emperor's personal intervention and multiple Legion strength forces, resources that the 32nd Millennium Imperium could not easily replicate, but the alternative of allowing the greenskins to continue expanding was unacceptable. The planning for the Ulanor assault began while Terra still prepared for the attack moon's arrival, the military leadership recognizing that they would need to conduct offensive and defensive operations simultaneously. The forces allocated to the strike on Ulanor would be drawn from Space Marine chapters, Imperial Navy battle fleets, and Astra Militarum regiments that had been gathering in staging areas throughout Segmentum Obscurus. The Space Marines would provide the assault spearhead, their capability for rapid deployment and combat effectiveness in close quarters making them ideal for the kind of decapitation strike that the operation required. The Imperial Navy would transport these forces and provide orbital fire support, their battleships and cruisers engaging Ork void defenses to create windows for ground force deployment. The Astra Militarum regiments would follow the initial assault, their numbers necessary to hold ground that the Space Marines captured and to provide the sustained combat power needed for extended operations. The first assault wave departed for Ulanor 3 weeks before the attack moon reached Terra's orbit, the timing calculated to ensure that the strike would occur before the Orks could reinforce their capital world in response to the threat against their attack moon. The fleet that translated into the Ulanor system consisted of 15 Imperial Navy cruisers, 30 escorts, and transport vessels carrying elements from 6 different Space Marine chapters, along with supporting Astra Militarum forces. The Fist's exemplar contributed 3 companies under Chapter Master Thane. The Crimson Fist sent 2 companies specializing in void warfare. The Black Templars deployed Crusade elements, numbering approximately 400 warriors. Smaller contingents from the Excoriators, Soul Drinkers, and Iron Knights brought the total Space Marine strength to roughly 1,500 warriors, a significant force but one that represented less than 2 full chapters' worth of combat power. The Ork defenses that met the Imperial fleet exceeded the worst-case projections that intelligence officers had prepared. 3 attack moons held positions throughout the Ulanor system, their gravitational weapons engaging Imperial vessels at ranges that forced the fleet to maneuver through a gauntlet of fire that began destroying ships before they could achieve useful tactical positions. The first cruiser lost was the Unbreakable Resolve, a vessel that had served the Imperial Navy for over 3,000 years. Gravitational beams caught the ship amidships, the forces involved crushing the cruiser's hull like parchment crumpled in a fist. The plasma reactor breach that followed consumed 2 nearby escorts, their void shields insufficient to protect them from the thermal pulse that radiated from the dying cruiser. The fleet pressed forward despite these losses, the Navy captains understanding that retreat would accomplish nothing except to waste the ships already destroyed. The Ork fleet that rose to meet the Imperial assault demonstrated coordination that transformed what should have been a chaotic greenskin response into something approaching professional naval doctrine. Ork battleships, crude constructs covered in armor plating and weapon emplacements, maneuvered to establish firing positions that maximized their numerical advantage while minimizing their exposure to Imperial lance batteries. Smaller Ork vessels, equivalents to Imperial escorts and frigates, conducted screening operations that prevented the Imperial fleet from concentrating fire on priority targets. The greenskin vessels fought with a discipline that seemed impossible, maintaining formation integrity and executing tactical maneuvers that suggested actual void warfare training rather than the typical Ork approach of pointing ships at the enemy and accelerating to ramming speed. Chapter Master Thane commanded the assault from aboard the strike cruiser Alcazar Remembered, his command squad monitoring Vox traffic and sensor data as the fleet fought its way deeper into the system. The Fist's Exemplar had prepared for this operation with the thoroughness that characterized their chapter, their warriors having studied every available piece of intelligence about Ork capabilities, and having conducted training exercises that simulated the kind of combat they expected to encounter. Thane himself had fought Orks across dozens of campaigns during his 4 centuries of service, but the enemy he faced now bore little resemblance to the disorganized mobs he had defeated in the past. The chapter master watched as Ork vessels executed flanking maneuvers that forced Imperial ships to divide their fire, as greenskin boarding parties teleported onto Imperial vessels with a precision that suggested sophisticated targeting systems, as the attack moons coordinated their fire to create kill zones that the Imperial fleet struggled to avoid. The breakthrough that allowed the assault force to reach Ulener's orbit came at catastrophic cost. 7 cruisers and 18 escorts were destroyed or crippled during the approach, their sacrifice buying time and space for the surviving vessels to achieve positions from which they could deploy ground forces. The Space Marine strike cruisers, their armor and void shields superior to standard Navy vessels, bore the brunt of the final approach, their hulls scarred by impacts from Ork weapons, but their essential systems intact. The Thunderhawks and drop pods that launched toward Ulener's surface carried Space Marines who understood that they were descending into what might be the most dangerous combat operation any of them had experienced. The orbital bombardment that preceded the ground assault achieved limited success, the Ork void shields protecting key installations, proving resilient enough to absorb punishment that would have leveled unprotected cities. The landing zones that the Space Marines secured on Ulener's surface lay in the outskirts of the massive palace fortress that intelligence had identified as the beast's primary stronghold. The architecture that surrounded the Space Marines as they advanced combined crude Ork construction with elements that parodied Imperial design, columns and arches built from scrap metal and looted materials, but arranged in patterns that suggested actual aesthetic considerations. The Orks defending these approaches fought with a ferocity that matched anything the Space Marines had encountered, but they also demonstrated tactical awareness that made them far more dangerous than typical greenskins. Ork forces established firing positions that maximized their defensive advantages, fell back in good order when positions became untenable, and coordinated their actions across multiple squads without apparent communication difficulties. Thane led the advance toward the palace fortress itself, his company fighting through Ork positions that had been prepared with an attention to defensive engineering that seemed impossible for greenskins. Barricades incorporated interlocking fields of fire, fortifications included redundant defensive layers that prevented single breakthrough points from compromising entire positions, and the Orks defending these works fought with a determination that suggested they understood the strategic importance of holding their ground. The chapter master's power sword, a relic blade that had been carried by Fist's Exemplar commanders for over a millennium, cut through Ork armor and flesh as he led from the front in the manner that his chapter's traditions demanded. The Space Marines around him maintained the disciplined fire and movement that their training emphasized, their bolters barking in controlled bursts that dropped Orks with nearly every shot. The palace fortress interior that the Space Marines breached after hours of fighting through the outer defenses revealed the true scale of what the Orks had constructed. Chambers that could have held thousands of greenskins stretched into the distance, their walls covered in crude murals that depicted Ork victories and conquests. The architecture incorporated looted Imperial materials, columns made from melted-down Imperial armor plating, and floors constructed from compressed debris that might once have been starship hulls. The Space Marines advanced through corridors wide enough to accommodate Ork vehicles, their formation maintained despite the disorienting scale of the construction. The defenders they encountered grew larger and better, equipped as they penetrated deeper, the Orks protecting the palace's interior, representing elite formations that wore sophisticated armor and carried weapons that functioned with a reliability that approached Imperial standards. The throne room that the Space Marines finally reached after fighting through kilometers of palace corridors contained a sight that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The beast that occupied the massive throne at the chamber's far end stood approximately 10 meters tall, its physiology representing the ultimate expression of Ork genetic potential. The creature's musculature was so dense that it appeared as if the beast's skin might split under the pressure of the muscles beneath. Its armor incorporated technology that combined Ork aesthetics with sophistication that suggested actual engineering principles, power systems that glowed with barely contained energy and defensive fields that shimmered visibly in the throne room's dim light. The beast's eyes, small and red in its massive head, tracked the Space Marines with an intelligence that was immediately apparent, the creature's gaze suggesting cognitive capability that approached or exceeded human baseline. The beast spoke, its voice a rumbling bass that carried across the throne room without apparent amplification. The creature used low Gothic with an accent, but with grammatical correctness that demonstrated genuine language capability rather than the pidgin that most Orks employed. The beast addressed Thane directly, identifying the chapter master by name and chapter affiliation, information that the greenskin should not have possessed. The creature's words carried both threat and what might have been respect, the beast acknowledging the Space Marines' fighting prowess while making clear that their assault on Ulanor would fail. The psychological impact of hearing an Ork speak with such clarity and intelligence affected even the Space Marines, warriors who had been conditioned to view greenskins as savage xenos incapable of sophisticated thought. The combat that erupted when Thane rejected the beast's offer to surrender and withdraw demonstrated the creature's physical capabilities. The beast moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size, covering the distance between its throne and the Space Marine formation in seconds. Its power claw, a massive weapon that crackled with disruptive energy fields, caught the first Space Marine who attempted to intercept it and tore the warrior in half despite his power armor. The beast's other hand wielded what appeared to be a heavily modified bolter scaled to its massive frame, the weapon firing rounds that punched through ceramite plate as if it were paper. The Space Marines concentrated their fire on the beast, bolter rounds and plasma shots converging on the creature from multiple angles, but the beast's personal shields absorbed the impacts, the defensive fields flaring with each hit but never quite failing. Thane engaged the beast directly, his power sword striking at joints and weak points in the creature's armor, with the precision that came from centuries of combat experience. The chapter master's blade carved through the beast's defenses in several places, drawing blood that was almost black in color, and that steamed when it hit the throne room floor. The beast responded with attacks that would have killed lesser warriors, its power claw missing Thane by centimeters on multiple occasions, as the chapter master's enhanced reflexes allowed him to dodge strikes that his armor could not have withstood. The duel between Space Marine and Prime Ork became the focal point of the broader combat, other Orks and Space Marines fighting around them, while their respective leaders tested each other's capabilities. The revelation that shattered the Space Marines' understanding of what they faced came when additional beasts entered the throne room through passages that the initial assault had not detected. The creatures were identical in size and general appearance to the first beast, their armor and weapons showing individual variations, but their basic physiology suggesting that they were all examples of the same phenomenon. The intelligence that had suggested multiple beasts commanded the Ork Empire proved accurate, but seeing 4 Prime Orks in the same location drove home the magnitude of the threat in ways that written reports could not convey. Each beast radiated the same psychic pressure, the combined Wa energy they generated creating an almost physical force that pressed against the Space Marines' minds. The additional beasts moved to support their fellow, their coordination suggesting either practiced teamwork or some form of psychic communication that allowed them to act in concert. The Space Marine assault force found itself fighting a battle they could not win, the combined might of multiple beasts and their elite guards overwhelming even transhuman warriors in power armor. Thane ordered a fighting retreat, his warriors maintaining fire discipline as they withdrew toward the extraction points they had established during their advance. The chapter master himself served as rearguard, his command squad holding positions that allowed other Space Marines to fall back while they absorbed the brunt of Ork counterattacks. The casualties mounted with every meter of corridor the Space Marines yielded, warriors who had served their chapters for decades or centuries, dying to buy seconds of time for their brothers to escape. The beasts pursued with a relentlessness that suggested they understood the importance of preventing any Space Marines from escaping to report what they had discovered. The extraction that followed the failed assault on the palace fortress occurred under fire that destroyed several Thunderhawks before they could lift off with their passengers. The Space Marines who reached the landing zones found themselves fighting to board transports, while Ork forces pressed them from multiple directions, the greenskins having apparently anticipated the Imperial withdrawal routes and positioned forces to interdict them. The Navy vessels in orbit provided fire support when possible, their lance batteries and bombardment cannons striking Ork positions that threatened the extraction, but the Ork void shields protecting key areas limited the effectiveness of orbital fire. The final Space Marine to board the last Thunderhawk departing Ulanner's surface was a battle brother from the Crimson Fists, whose armor had been so badly damaged that he was barely ambulatory, the warrior dragging himself up the assault ramp while Orks fired at him from less than 50 meters away. The fleet that withdrew from the Ulanner system had been reduced to 8 cruisers and 14 escorts, the losses representing nearly half the naval strength that had entered the system hours earlier. The Space Marine casualties approached 40%, with over 600 warriors dead or missing, and many of the survivors carrying wounds that would require extensive treatment. Chapter Master Thane had survived the engagement but bore injuries that would have killed a normal human several times over, his body sustained by his enhanced physiology and the emergency medical care that his apothecaries provided during the withdrawal. The intelligence that the survivors brought back to Imperial command justified the losses in strategic terms, but the human cost of confirming that multiple beasts existed and that they possessed near Primarch-level combat capabilities was devastating to the chapters involved. The assessment that Corland conducted after receiving reports from the first Ulanner assault confirmed what many senior officers had suspected but hoped was not true. A single assault, even one conducted with the full strength of multiple Space Marine chapters and supporting Imperial forces, would not be sufficient to eliminate the beasts and collapse the Ork Empire. Each beast would require its own targeted operation, multiple campaigns conducted either simultaneously or in sequence to eliminate the prime Orks before the surviving beasts could consolidate their control. The strategic implications were clear and grim. The Imperium would need to commit resources on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade itself, would need to conduct multiple major military operations while simultaneously defending Terra and other critical systems, and would need to accept casualties that would devastate the Space Marine chapters and Imperial forces involved. The political response to the first Ulanner assault's failure divided the reconstituted High Lords between those who argued for immediate follow-up operations and those who advocated for a strategic pause to rebuild forces and gather intelligence. Vangorich pushed for continued offensive operations, arguing that allowing the Orks time to recover and reinforce would only make subsequent assaults more difficult. The new Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum countered that throwing forces at Ulanner without adequate preparation would simply waste lives without achieving strategic objectives. The debate consumed weeks while the military situation continued to deteriorate, Ork forces expanding their territory, and the attack moon threatening Terra, drawing ever closer to the throne world's orbit. The decision to launch a second assault on Ulanor came after intelligence indicated that one of the beasts had been wounded during the first engagement, the creature's injuries potentially making it vulnerable to a targeted strike. The reconstituted Imperial fists, now led by the warrior who had taken the name Corland in honor of his fallen predecessor, would spearhead this assault. The new Corland had been Captain Slaughter before assuming his current identity. His elevation to chapter master and his adoption of his predecessor's name representing a symbolic continuity that the Imperium desperately needed. The chapter he commanded consisted of survivors from multiple Imperial Fist's successor chapters who had chosen to join the reconstituted parent chapter rather than return to their original organizations, their decision creating a force that combined traditions and capabilities from across the Sons of Dorn. The second assault on Ulanor achieved what the first had not, though the cost proved nearly catastrophic. The combined Imperial forces managed to isolate and kill one of the beasts through coordinated strikes that drew on lessons learned from the initial failure. The operation required 3 separate assault waves, each one pushing deeper into the palace fortress complex while suffering casualties that would have broken conventional forces. The Ordinatus weapon, deployed after Space Marines had secured sufficient territory around the target location, delivered the killing blow that brought down the wounded beast. The creature's death triggered a psychic backlash that killed several hundred orcs in the immediate vicinity and temporarily disrupted greenskin coordination across the entire Ulanor system. The Imperial forces withdrew before the remaining beasts could organize an effective counterattack, their victory measured not in territory held, but in the confirmed elimination of one prime orc. The pattern established by this second assault would repeat across the following years as the Imperium launched additional strikes against Ulanor and other orc-controlled systems. Each beast required its own targeted operation, campaigns that drew on the full strength of multiple Space Marine chapters and supporting Imperial forces. The Black Templars led an assault that killed a second beast through a boarding action against an attack moon, Marshal Magnaric's crusade companies fighting through kilometers of orc-infested corridors to reach the creature's command center. The Fist's exemplar coordinated with Imperial Navy forces to destroy a third beast when the Prime Orc attempted to personally lead an assault on an Imperial stronghold. The combined fire from orbital weapons and ground-based defenses overwhelming even the creature's formidable defenses. The remaining beasts fell one by one over a period of approximately 3 years, each death requiring months of planning and preparation, followed by brutal combat that left the attacking forces depleted. The Orc Empire did not collapse immediately upon the deaths of the beasts, contrary to what Imperial strategists had hoped based on historical precedents. The organizational structures and infrastructure that the Prime Orcs had established proved resilient enough to continue functioning even after their creators' deaths. Orc warlords who had served under the beasts maintained control over their territories and continued prosecuting the war against the Imperium, though without the strategic coordination that had made the Greenskin Empire so dangerous. The attack moons remained operational, their weapons and defenses still formidable, even if the tactical sophistication with which they were employed declined. The industrial complexes on Ulanor and other orc-controlled worlds continued producing weapons and equipment, their output sustained by momentum and the basic competence of orc mechboys who understood their functions, even if they lacked the beast's broader strategic vision. The fragmentation of the Orc Empire into competing warlord territories created opportunities for Imperial counteroffensives, but also ensured that the greenskin threat would persist for years beyond the beast's deaths. Each Orc warlord controlled multiple systems and commanded forces that numbered in the millions, their individual domains representing significant military challenges that required sustained campaigns to reduce. The Imperial forces that had been concentrated for the strikes against the beasts found themselves dispersed across dozens of systems, fighting grinding attritional warfare against orcs who reverted to more typical greenskin behavior, but who still possessed the advanced technology and fortifications that the beast's empire had produced. The reconquest of territories that the Orks had held proceeded slowly, each system requiring months or years of combat to secure fully. The political restructuring of the Imperium that occurred during and after the war against the beasts fundamentally altered how the High Lords of Terra functioned. The beheading had demonstrated the vulnerability of concentrating the Imperium's leadership in a single location without adequate security measures or succession planning. The reforms that Vangorich and the surviving High Lords implemented established clearer protocols for replacing deceased or incapacitated members of the council, created redundant command structures that could function if the primary leadership was eliminated, and improved security measures around the Senatorum Imperialis and other critical governmental facilities. The Adeptus Custodes expanded their role beyond protecting the Imperial Palace to include oversight of High Lord security, their presence at Senatorum sessions becoming standard practice rather than the occasional occurrence it had been previously. Draken Vangorich's influence over Imperial governance increased steadily as the war against the Orks progressed. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum had positioned himself as the individual most capable of making the difficult decisions that the crisis demanded, his willingness to act ruthlessly, and his control over the Imperium's assassination apparatus giving him power that extended far beyond his official position. Vangorich used this power to eliminate officials he deemed incompetent or corrupt, to influence military appointments and strategic decisions, and to shape Imperial policy in ways that reflected his own vision of what the Imperium required. The methods he employed operated largely in the shadows, but those within the upper levels of Imperial governance understood that opposing the Grand Master carried potentially fatal consequences. The tyrannical rule that Vangorich eventually established emerged gradually from the emergency powers he had accumulated during the war. The Grand Master argued that the Imperium's survival required centralized authority and decisive leadership, that the bureaucratic paralysis and political infighting that had characterized pre-war governance had nearly doomed humanity to Ork conquest. His position as one of the few High Lords who had maintained continuity throughout the crisis gave his arguments weight that they might not otherwise have carried. The other High Lords, many of whom owed their positions to Vangorich's behind-the-scenes maneuvering, proved reluctant to challenge his growing authority. The Senatorum Imperialis, cowed by the purges that had removed officials who opposed necessary military measures, rubber-stamped decisions that Vangorich presented as essential for continued prosecution of the war. The consolidation of power in Vangorich's hands continued after the last beast fell and the immediate military crisis passed. The Grand Master maintained that the Imperium remained vulnerable, that the Ork threat had not been fully eliminated, and that reverting to pre-war governmental structures would invite future disasters. He used the Officio Assassinorum to enforce his will, agents from the various temples eliminating individuals who posed threats to his authority or who advocated for reforms that would have limited his power. The other High Lords found themselves increasingly marginalized, their institutional authority eroded by Vangorich's willingness to act unilaterally and his control over the mechanisms of coercion that made opposition dangerous. The Imperium effectively operated under the rule of a single individual, though the formal structures of the High Lords' Council remained intact as a facade of collective governance. The assassination of Vangorich by Space Marines from the reformed Imperial Fists occurred approximately a decade after the last beast's death. The exact circumstances remained classified, but the general outline became known throughout the upper levels of Imperial governance. Vangorich had ordered the execution of a High Lord who had opposed one of his policies, the killing conducted by Officio Assassinorum agents in a manner that made clear the murder was deliberate rather than accidental. The remaining High Lords, recognizing that they served at Vangorich's pleasure and could be eliminated whenever he chose, secretly approached the Imperial Fists and requested that the chapter remove the Grand Master before his tyranny destroyed what remained of Imperial governmental institutions. The Space Marines who carried out the assassination did so understanding that they acted to preserve the Imperium's political structures rather than to serve any individual's interests. The political aftermath of Vangorich's death created temporary instability as the High Lords reasserted their collective authority and implemented reforms designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating similar power. The Officio Assassinorum underwent restructuring that limited the Grand Master's autonomy and established oversight mechanisms that would prevent the organization from being used as a personal tool of political control. The succession protocols that had been established after the beheading were refined and formalized, creating clear procedures for replacing High Lords and ensuring continuity of governance. The security measures around the Senatorum Imperialis were enhanced further, the lessons of both the Ork kill team's success and Vangorich's assassination informing improvements to defensive systems and screening procedures. The confusion regarding terminology that would persist in Imperial records stemmed from the use of the term beheading to describe both the Ork attack on the High Lords and Vangorich's eventual removal from power. Historical documents from the period sometimes conflated the two events or used the term without sufficient context to determine which incident was being referenced. The ambiguity reflected the chaotic nature of the period and the fact that official records were often compiled years or decades after the events they described, when details had become unclear and different sources provided contradictory accounts. Scholars and administratum officials attempting to construct accurate chronologies of the War of the Beast struggled with source materials that used identical terminology for distinct events separated by years. The reconstitution of the Imperial Fists chapter through the integration of successor chapter warriors established a precedent that would influence how the Imperium responded to future chapter-level losses. The warriors who joined the reformed Imperial Fists came primarily from the Fists Exemplar, whose chapter master Thane had assumed command of the reconstituted parent chapter after Corlin's death in the final battles against the Orks. Significant numbers also transferred from the Crimson Fists, Black Templars, and other successor chapters, their decision to join the Imperial Fists representing both practical necessity and symbolic importance. The reformed chapter adopted organizational structures and traditions that drew from all the successor chapters that contributed warriors, creating a synthesis that honored the diverse heritage of Rogal Dorn's gene line while maintaining the Imperial Fist's identity as a first founding chapter. The precedent established by this reconstitution suggested that Space Marine chapters could survive catastrophic losses through integration with their successors, that the genetic and cultural continuity represented by shared gene seed was more important than strict organizational independence. The Adeptus Terra formally recognized this principle, issuing guidance that authorized similar reconstitutions if other first founding chapters faced destruction. The practical implementation of this policy remained complex, as it required successor chapters to voluntarily subordinate themselves to a reconstituted parent chapter and to accept the loss of their own independent identities. The Imperial Fists case was unique in that the Last Wall Protocol had already established mechanisms for such integration, but extending the principle to other Legion lineages would require developing new frameworks and overcoming institutional resistance from chapters that valued their independence. The eventual dissolution of the unified Imperial Fists and the reformation of the successor chapters occurred approximately 2 centuries after the War of the Beast concluded. The decision reflected both practical considerations and political pressures from within the Adeptus Astartes. The unified chapter had grown to exceed Codex-mandated strength limits as recruitment continued, and the chapter rebuilt from its wartime losses. The geographic dispersion of the chapter's recruiting worlds and operational responsibilities made centralized command increasingly difficult. Perhaps most significantly, many of the Space Marines who had transferred from successor chapters to join the reformed Imperial Fists maintained cultural connections to their original organizations and advocated for the reestablishment of independent chapters. The dissolution was conducted in an organized manner that ensured each successor chapter received adequate gene seed stocks, equipment, and personnel to function as viable independent organizations. The reformation of the successor chapters created some ambiguity regarding their founding dates and historical continuity. Chapters like the Fists Exemplar, that had been effectively absorbed into the reformed Imperial Fists, faced questions about whether they should be considered second founding chapters with unbroken lineages, or whether they represented new foundings that happened to use historical names and heraldry. The Adeptus Terra resolved these questions pragmatically by recognizing the successor chapters' claims to their pre-War of the Beast identities, while acknowledging the period of integration in official records. The solution satisfied neither purists who argued for strict historical accuracy nor those who preferred to minimize the discontinuity, but it provided a workable framework that allowed the successor chapters to function without endless debates about their legitimacy. The long-term military impact of the War of the Beast fundamentally altered how the Imperium approached large-scale Xenos threats. The complacency that had characterized mid-32nd millennium Imperial governance and military planning was shattered by the recognition that the Imperium could face enemies capable of threatening Terra itself and of destroying first founding chapters. The doctrines developed during the war, particularly regarding Space Marine cooperation and the coordination of multi-chapter operations, became standard components of Adeptus Astartes training. The strategic principles that Courland and other commanders had established for responding to enemies with sophisticated technology and organizational capabilities were codified in tactical manuals that would influence Imperial military thinking for millennia. The improvements to planetary defense protocols that emerged from the war's lessons addressed the systemic weaknesses that had allowed Orks to conquer Forge worlds and other critical installations with relative ease. The Adeptus Mechanicus implemented enhanced security measures around Forge world defenses, including redundant void shield generators, improved orbital weapons platforms, and larger permanent Skitarii garrisons. The Astra Militarum developed doctrine for rapid response to Xenos incursions, creating mobile reserve forces that could be deployed to threatened systems before situations deteriorated to the point where reconquest became necessary. The Imperial Navy reorganized its fleet dispositions to ensure that major concentrations of ships remained available for emergency response rather than being dispersed across routine patrol and garrison duties. The protocols for Space Marine cooperation that the Last Wall Protocol had demonstrated became templates for similar arrangements among other Legion lineages. The Ultramarines and their successors developed coordination frameworks that would allow rapid concentration of forces if Ultramar or other critical systems faced existential threats. The Blood Angels established communication networks and strategic planning mechanisms that would enable their successors to unite if circumstances demanded. These arrangements operated within the constraints of the Codex Astartes and the political realities that made permanent Legion-scale formations unacceptable, but they provided mechanisms for temporary cooperation that balanced the need for concentrated military power against concerns about preventing another Horus Heresy. The psychological impact on the Imperium extended beyond military doctrine to affect how Imperial citizens and institutions understood humanity's place in the galaxy. The confidence that had characterized the mid-32nd millennium, the assumption that the Imperium's military superiority and the Emperor's protection guaranteed humanity's dominance, was replaced by a more realistic assessment of the threats the Imperium faced. The recognition that Xeno species like the Orks could develop technological capabilities matching or exceeding Imperial standards, that enemies could penetrate to Terra itself, and that even Space Marine chapters were not invulnerable, created a cultural shift toward greater vigilance and preparation. The propaganda that the ecclesiarchy and administratum disseminated emphasized eternal struggle rather than inevitable victory, framing the Imperium's survival as dependent on constant effort rather than guaranteed by divine protection. The War of the Beast established patterns that would characterize Imperial responses to major threats throughout the following millennia. The concentration of authority during crises, the willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, the coordination of Space Marine chapters for large-scale operations, and the recognition that some enemies required the full mobilization of Imperial resources all became standard elements of how the Imperium prosecuted existential wars. The specific mechanisms varied depending on circumstances and the particular threats involved, but the fundamental principles that emerged from the war against the beasts remained consistent. The Imperium that survived the War of the Beast was harder, more paranoid, and more willing to employ ruthless methods than the Empire that had entered the 32nd millennium, the transformation reflecting lessons learned through catastrophic losses and near defeat. The Ork threat that persisted after the beasts' deaths required decades of additional campaigning to reduce to manageable levels. The greenskin warlords who inherited fragments of the beasts' empire lacked the strategic sophistication of the prime Orks, but they controlled substantial territories and commanded forces equipped with advanced technology that the beasts' industrial complexes had produced. The Imperial forces that conducted these campaigns operated with the tactical doctrine and coordination mechanisms developed during the war, their effectiveness improved by experience and by the implementation of lessons learned through years of combat. The Reconquest proceeded system by system, each victory reducing Ork capabilities, but each operation requiring sustained effort and accepting casualties that accumulated over years of grinding warfare. The final assessment of the War of the Beasts' impact recognized that the Imperium had survived, but had been fundamentally changed by the experience. The political structures that governed humanity's empire operated differently, with greater centralization during crises and improved mechanisms for coordination across institutions that had previously guarded their independence jealously. The military capabilities that the Imperium could bring to bear had been tested and refined, the Space Marines and other Imperial forces having developed doctrine specifically designed for combating sophisticated Xenos threats. The psychological transformation from complacency to vigilance ensured that the Imperium would never again dismiss warnings about emerging threats or assume that humanity's dominance was guaranteed rather than maintained through constant struggle. The War of the Beast ended the age of confidence that had characterized the mid-32nd millennium and began the long descent into the darker, more desperate Imperium that would face the challenges of the 41st millennium and beyond.